I am Dexter Cole, 75 years old. At my own son's charity gala, he laughed into a microphone and auctioned me off for $2. He told a room of 250 Chicago elites that I was a useless old man who only knew how to trim hedges and complain. I sat there in my faded suit while his wealthy friends roared with laughter. My white daughter-in-law, Brittany, covered her mouth to hide her smirk. I felt the humiliation burn in my chest. But then a stranger stepped out from the back of the room and shouted, $2 million! What happened next wiped the smirk right off my son's face and brought his fake empire crashing down. Before I tell you the rest of my story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you believe respect should never be auctioned off. The blinding spotlight swung across the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel and hit me right in the face. I squinted against the harsh glare. Up on the stage stood Kendrick, my 40-year-old son. He was wearing a custom tuxedo that cost more than my first car. He gripped a crystal champagne flute in one hand and a microphone in the other. He had the crowd of 250 Chicago elites eating out of the palm of his hand. Real estate moguls, corrupt politicians, and bored socialites all dressed to the nines, drinking top-shelf liquor and writing fat checks for Kendrick's supposedly noble charity foundation. Then Kendrick pointed straight at my table in the back corner. It was the dark corner where they put the people they do not want in the professional photographs. I was seated next to the kitchen doors where the waiters rushed past me all night. And for our final gag auction of the night, Kendrick announced, his voice booming through the speakers. I present to you my dad, Dexter. He trims the hedges, he complains about the thermostat, and he falls asleep watching the local news at 7. Who wants to take him off my hands? Let's start the bidding at a generous $2. The ballroom erupted. 250 people threw their heads back and laughed. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers. It was a thick, cruel laughter that crawled under my skin. I looked over at the VIP table right next to the stage. There sat Brittany, my daughter-in-law. She adjusted her diamond necklace and covered a snicker with her manicured hand, throwing me a look of pure pity mixed with disgust. She leaned over and whispered something to her wealthy friends, and they all laughed even harder. To them, I was just the embarrassing old relative, the punchline to a rich man's joke. I sat absolutely still and looked down at my worn suit jacket. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs. It was the only suit I brought with me when I moved into the guest room of their massive mansion a few years ago. Kendrick thought I was just a broke pensioner living off a meager Social Security check. He thought I was a fragile old man who desperately needed his charity to survive. He forgot who raised him. He forgot the 30 years of blood, sweat, and tears I poured into the brutal trenches of Chicago South Side real estate. I scraped lead paint off decaying walls and flipped abandoned properties in neighborhoods his rich friends would not even drive through with their doors locked. I broke my back laying bricks and dealing with corrupt city inspectors so I could pay his tuition at Harvard in full. I gave him the foundation to become the man standing on that stage. But Harvard did not teach him respect. It only taught him how to wear a tailored suit and look down on the people who built his pedestal. I never told him about the fortune I quietly amassed over the decades. I wanted to see the measure of his character. I wanted to see if wealth would turn him into a leader or a monster. The answer was standing right in front of me holding a champagne glass. Do I hear $3? Kendrick joked, leaning into the microphone, his eyes scanning the laughing crowd. Come on, folks. The man can fix a leaky faucet. That has to be worth the price of a cheap cup of coffee. More laughter filled the room. A local politician raised his hand jokingly from the front row. I will give you $2.50, Kendrick. Sold. Kendrick laughed, raising his glass to the politician. I did not yell. I did not cry. I just took a slow sip of my ice water. My silence was not submission. It was a countdown. You see, Kendrick thought he owned the room. He thought he owned me. But a wise man never shows his hand until the bets are locked in. I had been watching him and Brittany for years. I had watched them treat me like a nuisance in my own home. I had watched them blow through millions to keep up appearances, leasing luxury cars and throwing parties they could not afford. And I knew the dark truth about the empire Kendrick claimed he built from scratch. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the very back of the ballroom swung open with a loud thud. A cold, booming voice cut straight through the laughter and the clinking glasses. $2 million. The entire room fell dead silent. Every head snapped around. Standing in the center aisle was Dominic. He was a towering man in a bespoke black suit, his face set like stone. Dominic was not a guest. He did not belong to their country club circle. Dominic was my corporate fixer, my closest confidant, and the most ruthless lawyer in the city of Chicago. And nobody in that room knew he worked for me. Dominic walked down the center aisle with slow, deliberate steps. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. The smirk on Kendrick's face froze instantly. He lowered his microphone, his eyes darting between Dominic and the security guards who were too intimidated by Dominic's presence to even move. Brittany stopped laughing and sat up straight in her chair, her eyes wide with confusion. Dominic reached the front of the room. He did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge the mayor or the investors. He walked straight up the carpeted steps onto the stage. He reached inside his suit jacket, pulled out a certified bank check, and dropped it flat on Kendrick's podium. The sound of the thick paper hitting the wood echoed in the dead, silent room. Kendrick stared at the check. He let out a nervous little laugh, trying to regain control of his audience. He wiped a drop of sweat from his forehead. "Well, this is incredibly generous," he stammered, reaching out for the piece of paper. "A $2 million donation to our charity foundation tonight. This is historic." Before Kendrick's fingers could even brush the paper, Dominic slammed his massive hand down on top of the check, pinning it to the podium. He leaned in close to the microphone so every single person in the room could hear his next words clearly. "This is not a donation to your fraudulent charity," Kendrick Dominic said, his voice dripping with ice. "This is the buyout payment for 51% of your real estate company." Kendrick pulled his hand back as if he had been burned by a hot stove. He looked at Dominic like the man was completely insane. "Buyout payment," he repeated, his voice cracking in front of the silent crowd. "My company is not for sale, and I am the sole owner. You have lost your mind. Get off my stage." Dominic did not blink. He turned his head slowly and pointed directly at me, sitting in the dark corner in my frayed suit. "You do not own the company, Kendrick," Dominic announced, his voice echoing off the walls. "You never did. This is the buyout payment for the majority shares, which actually belong to your father, Dexter Cole." The ballroom erupted in a massive wave of chaotic whispers and gasps. Hundreds of eyes shifted from Kendrick on the stage to me sitting in the back. Brittany dropped her champagne glass and it shattered on the floor. I slowly set my water glass down on the table. I stood up, buttoned my worn jacket, and looked my son dead in the eye. The game was over. The silent adjustment had begun. The ballroom exploded into a frantic symphony of gasps and chaotic whispers. 100 cell phones were instantly pulled out, recording the collapse of the golden boy of Chicago real estate. Flash bulbs went off blindingly bright, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers. Kendrick was hyperventilating. The vein in his neck throbbed so violently I thought it might burst through his skin. He rushed down the carpeted steps of the stage, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor. He marched straight toward me, grabbing my arm with a grip that was meant to intimidate, but I did not flinch. I stood like a brick wall. Brittany was right behind him, her face flushed with a toxic mixture of rage and profound embarrassment. She barked at the security guards to clear the hallway, swatting away the hands of her wealthy friends who tried to ask what was happening. We walked through the heavy, swinging kitchen doors, leaving the gasping elite behind us. Dominic followed close behind me, a silent mountain of a man, casting a massive shadow over my son and his wife. We entered the VIP green room, a luxurious space reserved solely for Kendrick to stroke his massive ego before his speeches. The door slammed shut with a heavy thud, completely cutting off the noise of the ballroom. The silence inside that room was heavy, suffocating, and thick with impending doom. Kendrick spun around like a cornered animal. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Dominic and then at me. "What is this old fool talking about?" he screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. "You are a retired janitor. You spent your entire life scrubbing floors, breathing in paint fumes, and fixing leaky toilets in the slums. You have nothing. You are nothing. Tell this lunatic to get out of my event right now before I have him arrested for trespassing and fraud." I looked at my son. He was 40 years old, wearing a $10,000 custom tuxedo, standing in a room overflowing with catered food and imported champagne, and he was throwing a tantrum like a spoiled toddler who had just dropped his ice cream. Brittany paced the room, her designer high heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor. "Kendrick, do something," she hissed, her voice shrill and demanding. "The mayor of Chicago is out there. Our primary investors are out there. You are looking like an absolute joke in front of the only people who matter." Dominic calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket. He did not say a word. He simply reached inside his coat and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table in the center of the room. It landed with a heavy smack that made Kendrick flinch. Kendrick stared at the folder as if it were a live grenade. I stepped forward, slowly adjusting the frayed cuffs of my old suit jacket. 15 years ago, I began my voice steady and low, carrying the weight of decades of hard labor. You came to me begging for seed money to start your commercial real estate firm. You had a fancy degree from Harvard, but absolutely no capital. No commercial bank in this city would look twice at a kid with no assets and a mountain of student debt. So I gave you $100,000 of my own hard-earned money. I gave you the money I made breaking my back laying bricks and dealing with corrupt city inspectors in neighborhoods your rich friends would not even drive through. Kendrick scoffed, crossing his arms in a desperate attempt to look authoritative. Yeah, and I paid you back with interest years ago. I built Cole Holdings from the ground up. I am the founder. I am the sole owner. This is my empire. Dominic let out a low, dry chuckle that chilled the room. You really never read the fine print, did you, Kendrick? Dominic stepped forward, opened the folder, and spread the original limited liability company operating agreements across the glass table. Look at page 7, paragraph 4. Kendrick hesitated. His arrogance fought against his growing terror. He leaned over the table. His eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. I watched the color completely drain from his face. His hands began to shake violently. You see, son, I said, taking a step closer so he could hear every single syllable clearly. When I handed you those papers 15 years ago, you were too arrogant to read them. You were so eager to play the big-shot executive to print your name on glossy business cards and lease a corner office that you just signed on the dotted line without consulting a lawyer. I did not give you a business loan, Kendrick. I provided the initial capital investment in exchange for 51% voting rights in the holding company. You hold 49%. You have never been the sole owner. For a decade and a half, you have been nothing more than my employee, a glorified manager collecting a bloated paycheck on my payroll. Brittany stopped pacing. She looked at Kendrick, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Kendrick, tell me this is a lie, she demanded, grabbing his shoulder. Tell me he is bluffing right now. Kendrick could not speak. He kept reading the signatures, his own signature clear as day right beneath the clause that stripped him of all ultimate financial authority. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a pitiful mix of terror and disbelief. But I am the chief executive officer, he whispered, his voice completely hollow, stripped of all its previous bravado. I looked him dead in the eye. All the paternal warmth I once held for him had been permanently burned away by his cruelty tonight. I gave you the title of CEO to see if you could be a real man. I said my words cutting through the air like a razor blade. I gave you the reins to see if you could build a lasting legacy for this family. I wanted to see if wealth would make you a leader of the community. Instead, you chose to be a clown. You used my company to fund your country club memberships, your luxury vacations, and your fake charity galas. You sat out there and auctioned off your own father for $2 to impress a room full of strangers. I paused, letting the crushing weight of reality settle onto his shoulders. You are officially fired, Kendrick. Pack up your desk by tomorrow morning. The room spun into absolute chaos. Brittany let out a blood-curdling scream. It was not a scream of sadness or heartbreak. It was the primal, furious shriek of a greedy woman watching her unlimited bank accounts evaporate into thin air. Are you insane? She yelled, lunging toward the coffee table. You cannot fire him. You cannot take the company from us. We need that $2 million check. We need it right now. I looked at her, raising an eyebrow in mock confusion. Why would you need my $2 million, Brittany? You just bought a brand new Mercedes-Benz last week. You live in a $10 million mansion in the suburbs. You throw lavish parties. You have it all figured out, do you not? She grabbed Kendrick's arm, her manicured nails digging deep into his expensive tuxedo jacket. Tell him, she shrieked, shaking him violently. Tell him the truth right now, or I swear I will. Kendrick looked like he was about to vomit. He backed away from his wife, unable to look me in the eye. We are in debt, he mumbled, barely audible, staring at his shoes. I stepped closer, invading his space. Speak up, boy. Be the man you claim to be. We are $5 million in debt, he yelled, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over his eyelids. The Oakwood Luxury Development Project. The primary investors pulled out 3 months ago when the zoning permits failed. I took out a massive high-interest bridge loan from a ruthless private equity firm to keep the construction crews working. I leveraged everything we have to secure the loan. Brittany shoved Kendrick aside with disgust and stepped right into my face, her eyes wild with desperation. If we do not show $2 million in liquid capital by Monday morning, the bank is calling in the entire loan, she screamed, spit flying from her lips. They will seize the Oakwood property. They will freeze all the corporate accounts, and they will foreclose on our mansion. We will be out on the street with absolutely nothing. She pointed a shaking, frantic finger at the certified check still resting in Dominic's massive hand. That buyout money belongs to us. It is the only thing that can satisfy the bank and save the Oakwood project. Hand over that check right now, you miserable old man. You owe us this. You cannot ruin our lives over a stupid joke. I looked at Brittany. I took in the sight of her expensive designer dress, her sparkling diamond earrings, and the sheer repulsive entitlement radiating from her tear-streaked face. Then I looked at my son. He was a broken, pathetic shell of a man weeping in his custom suit, waiting for his elderly daddy to bail him out of a massive financial disaster of his own making. They had treated me like garbage for years, and now they demanded my life savings to rescue their facade. I reached out slowly and took the certified check from Dominic's hand. I held it up in the dim light of the green room. Brittany gasped, reaching her hand out eagerly, fully expecting me to hand over the millions to save her luxurious lifestyle. She thought my paternal instinct would override my common sense. Instead, I slowly folded the crisp, heavy piece of paper in half. Then I folded it again, making it small and compact. I slid the $2 million check into the breast pocket of my frayed, worn-out suit jacket. I patted the pocket flat, making sure it was secure. $2, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute finality. That is what you decided I was worth tonight, Kendrick. $2. Let us see exactly how much you are worth by Monday morning when the bank comes knocking. I turned my back on them. Dominic opened the heavy wooden door, stepping aside to let me pass. I walked out of the green room, my head held high, leaving them screaming and crying in the ashes of their fake empire. The silent adjustment had officially begun, and I was not going to stop until they lost everything. I woke up before the sun even thought about rising over the Chicago skyline. 40 years of waking up at dawn to lay bricks and negotiate contracts leaves a permanent clock in your blood. I dressed in a clean pressed shirt and walked down the sweeping marble staircase of my son's $10 million mansion. The house was dead quiet. Usually I would go to the kitchen and make pancakes for my 7-year-old grandson Malik. He was the only pure thing left in this toxic environment. The boy had my late wife's eyes and a spirit that had not yet been poisoned by his mother's greed. I walked toward his bedroom down the long, carpeted hallway. But before my hand could even touch the brass doorknob, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Step away from that door." I turned slowly. There stood Brittany. She was wearing a silk robe clutching a cup of black coffee. Her face was pale from a sleepless night of panic, but her eyes were full of venom. "You are not going near my son," she hissed, taking a step forward to physically block the door. "You are unstable, Dexter. After that little stunt you pulled last night at the gala, I am not letting a crazy old man anywhere near my child." I looked at her. The sheer audacity of this woman was almost impressive. She was trying to weaponize my own grandson against me. I kept my voice perfectly level. "The only thing unstable in this house, Brittany, is your bank account. Malik is my blood. You cannot keep him away from me forever." She let out a cold, harsh laugh. "Watch me," she sneered. "In fact, you will not be seeing much of anyone anymore. We are getting you the help you so desperately need." I turned and walked downstairs. I knew exactly what she meant. She was cornered, and a cornered rat will bite at anything. Exactly 2 hours later, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion chimed. I was sitting in the formal living room reading the morning paper. Kendrick rushed down the stairs looking disheveled and frantic. He opened the door. Standing on the porch was a middle-aged woman carrying a thick clipboard and a very serious expression. She wore a badge on a lanyard indicating she was from Adult Protective Services. Brittany came rushing down the stairs right on cue, wearing a modest sweater and wiping away fake tears. "Oh, thank goodness you are here," Brittany cried out, rushing to the door and putting a trembling hand to her chest. "Please come in. It has been an absolute nightmare. My father-in-law has completely lost his mind." The agent stepped inside, looking around the grand foyer with a professional but sympathetic gaze. "I am Agent Reynolds," she said softly. "I received a very concerning call this morning regarding an elderly resident in this household who might be suffering from severe dementia and posing a danger to himself." Brittany nodded vigorously, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. "Yes, that is him in the living room. He has been hallucinating wildly. Last night he caused a massive scene at our charity event, claiming he was a secret millionaire and that he owned my husband's entire company. He is completely detached from reality. He is hoarding old papers and talking about money that does not exist. We are terrified he might hurt himself or wander out into the street. We just want to get a medical hold on him so we can legally manage his care and his finances before he does something tragic. I listened to her entire performance without moving a muscle. She wanted a medical hold. A medical hold would freeze my assets and grant Kendrick emergency conservatorship. It was a classic desperate move. If they could get the state to declare me incompetent, they could raid my accounts and save their sinking Oakwood luxury development before the bank foreclosed on Monday morning. Agent Reynolds walked into the living room, her posture gentle and unthreatening. She approached me as if I were a frightened animal. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said softly, taking a seat on the sofa across from me. "How are you feeling today?" I slowly folded my newspaper and placed it on the coffee table. I looked her dead in the eye. "I am feeling perfectly lucid, Agent Reynolds. Would you care for some Earl Grey tea? I just brewed a fresh pot." She blinked, caught off guard by my steady voice and calm demeanor. She had expected a rambling, confused old man. Instead, she was met with a man who had negotiated multi-million-dollar land deals with some of the most ruthless mobsters in the city. "No thank you, Mr. Cole," she stammered, opening her clipboard. "Sir, your family is very worried about you. They mentioned you have been experiencing some confusion regarding your finances." I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. An angry old man is exactly what Brittany wanted them to see. Instead, I reached under the coffee table and pulled out a pristine leather briefcase. I laid it flat on the glass table and snapped the brass locks open. I pulled out a stack of legally certified financial records, bank statements, and the original stamped operating agreements for Cole Holdings. "Agent Reynolds," I said, sliding the documents across the glass toward her. "These are my financial records. As you can see, I am the majority shareholder of the corporation my son currently manages. My net worth is thoroughly documented here, signed and verified by the top financial attorneys in the state of Illinois. I am not hallucinating about millions. I simply own them." Agent Reynolds picked up the papers. Her eyes widened as she scanned the official seals, the massive account balances, and the undeniable legal proof that the supposed poor old man was actually a titan of industry. Brittany stepped into the room, her face turning red. "Do not look at those," she yelled, her fake, sweet voice cracking. "Those are fake. He printed them off the internet. He is delusional." I ignored her and reached into my breast pocket. I pulled out my smartphone and tapped the screen. "Agent Reynolds?" I continued, my voice smooth and cold. "If you want to know the real reason my daughter-in-law called you here today under false pretenses, I suggest you listen to this audio recording. It was taken last night in the green room of the Drake Hotel." I pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. Brittany's shrill voice echoed through the quiet living room. "We are $5 million in debt. If we do not show $2 million in liquid capital by Monday morning, the bank is calling in the entire loan. They will seize the Oakwood property. We will be out on the street. Hand over that check right now, you miserable old man." The recording stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Agent Reynolds lowered the financial documents. The sympathetic look she had given Brittany earlier vanished completely, replaced by a hardened glare of pure professional disgust. She was no fool. She had seen cases of financial elder abuse before, but rarely one so brazen and poorly executed. She stood up, snapping her clipboard shut. "Mr. Cole, I sincerely apologize for the intrusion," she said, turning her back on Brittany and Kendrick. "It is abundantly clear to me that you are of sound mind and fully capable of managing your own affairs." She then turned her piercing gaze to Kendrick, who was sweating profusely by the doorway. "Falsifying a report to Adult Protective Services in an attempt to unlawfully seize an elderly person's assets is a serious crime. I am documenting this entire interaction. If you attempt to restrict Mr. Cole's movements or continue to harass him for his wealth, I will personally involve the police and forward this case to the district attorney for elder abuse and attempted fraud." Brittany stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. The safety net she thought she had woven had just wrapped around her own neck. Agent Reynolds marched out the front door, and the heavy oak slammed shut behind her. The moment the door closed, Kendrick completely snapped. He kicked a wooden side table, sending an expensive vase crashing to the floor. The clock was ticking. It was Saturday. The bank deadline was Monday morning. They had 48 hours before the foreclosure processes began, and they lost the mansion, the cars, and their fake social standing. Kendrick began pacing back and forth, pulling his hair. Brittany sat on the floor, weeping real tears of sheer terror. "We are dead," she sobbed. "We are completely dead." Kendrick stopped pacing. His eyes darted around the room, wild and desperate. "No," he muttered, his voice shaking with a dangerous adrenaline. "We are not dead. I just have to do this the hard way. He stormed out of the house, leaving the front door wide open. I sat quietly on the sofa, sipping my tea. I knew he was going to do something incredibly stupid. Greed makes people blind, but desperation makes them reckless. An hour later, tires screeched in the driveway. The heavy front doors swung open again. Kendrick walked in, followed by a sleazy-looking man wearing an expensive but poorly tailored suit carrying a black leather medical bag. I recognized him immediately. It was Dr. Vance, a disgraced cosmetic surgeon who spent more time drinking at Kendrick's elite country club than practicing medicine. He was a man known for writing fake prescriptions and providing convenient medical alibis for wealthy men who got into trouble. Kendrick locked the front door behind them and slid the deadbolt into place. Brittany stood up, wiping her face, a new wicked gleam appearing in her eyes. "You brought him," she whispered. Kendrick nodded, wiping sweat from his upper lip. He pointed directly at me. "Dr. Vance here is going to conduct a private in-home medical evaluation," Kendrick said, his voice trembling with a forced, menacing tone. "And he is going to officially determine that my father lacks the mental capacity to make legal decisions. Then my father is going to sign a medical and financial power of attorney, handing over all control to me. And if he refuses, Dr. Vance has a very strong sedative in that bag that will make him much more compliant." The two men began to walk slowly toward me, backing me into the corner of my own sitting room. Dr. Vance unclasped his leather medical bag, pulling out a thick stack of legal documents and a syringe. He smiled, a greasy, nervous smile. "Come on," Dexter Vance said smoothly. "Let us not make this difficult. Just sign the papers and go take a nice long nap. You are too old to be managing all that stress anyway. Let your boy take the wheel." I stood up from the sofa. I did not reach for a weapon. I did not shout for help. I looked at my son, who was willing to drug his own father to steal his legacy. I slowly reached into my breast pocket, pretending to reach for a pen to sign their fraudulent papers. But my fingers did not grab a pen. They found the cold, hard plastic of my digital voice recorder. With a silent, determined click, I pressed the record button. The red light blinked in the dark fabric of my pocket, capturing every single threat, every single breath of their criminal conspiracy. I looked Kendrick dead in the eye and prepared to drop the bait that would send him straight to federal prison. I felt the cold plastic of the digital recorder through the fabric of my pocket. The red light was blinking silently in the dark, capturing every breath of my son's treason. Dr. Vance took a step closer to me, holding a syringe filled with a heavy liquid sedative. His hands were shaking. He was a coward pretending to be a criminal. Kendrick stood behind him, sweating through his expensive designer shirt. His eyes were wide with a desperate, manic energy. "Sign the paper, Dexter," the fake doctor said, his voice slick with artificial sympathy. "Just sign the medical power of attorney. We do not want things to get ugly tonight. You are confused and you need rest." I knew exactly how to handle men who thought they held all the cards. You do not fight them directly. You feed their arrogance until they choke on it. I let my broad shoulders slump. I forced my hands to tremble just enough to look like a frightened old man whose mind was finally slipping away into the fog of dementia. I widened my eyes and backed into the corner of my own living room, letting a pathetic whimper escape my throat. "Please, Kendrick," I stammered intentionally, making my voice crack and pitch upward. "I do not understand what is happening here. Take the company, take the money, just do not let them take the key." Kendrick froze in his tracks. He signaled for the doctor to stop moving. "What key?" he demanded, taking a slow step toward me. "What are you talking about, old man?" I shook my head violently, playing the part of a paranoid patient perfectly. "The key," I whispered, grabbing my own collar as if I were struggling to breathe. "Box 402 at Chase Bank. The original Oakwood deeds are in there. Sylvia's papers. You cannot let the bank have them. They will take the land." I watched the exact moment the poison of greed hijacked my son's brain. The Oakwood project was the massive anchor pulling him to the bottom of the financial ocean. He was $5 million in debt to ruthless private equity lenders who did not play by traditional banking rules. If he could get his hands on the original physical deeds, he believed he could transfer the ownership entirely into his name, sign them over to the bank, and save his mansion. He did not need a messy medical hold or a drugged father if he had the physical deeds in his possession. "Put that syringe away," Kendrick snapped at the doctor, waving his hand dismissively. "He is cooperating. His mind is completely gone anyway. Get out of here, Vance. I will handle this myself." The disgraced doctor looked relieved to avoid committing a felony assault. He packed his black leather bag and hurried out of the front door without looking back. Kendrick turned to me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are absolutely pathetic," he muttered under his breath. "Go to your room, old man. Stay out of my sight for the rest of the night." I nodded, keeping my head down in submission. I shuffled past him, leaning heavily on the staircase railing for dramatic effect. I went straight to my bedroom and closed the heavy oak door. I reached into my pocket and stopped the recording. I had the entire interaction saved. But I was not going to the police yet. Calling the police right now would only get Kendrick a slap on the wrist for attempted coercion. I needed him to commit a crime so massive and so undeniable that he would never be able to show his arrogant face in the business world again. I sat on the edge of my mattress. I pulled a small silver key from my wallet and placed it right in the center of my wooden nightstand where it would catch the pale moonlight coming through the window. Then I lay down on the bed, pulled the covers up to my chest, and waited in the dark. 40 years ago, my wife Sylvia and I bought the Oakwood land. Back then, it was just a massive stretch of dirt and broken glass on the south side of Chicago. We bought it for next to nothing, working 3 exhausting jobs between the two of us. Sylvia used to say that land was going to be our ultimate legacy. She wanted to build a community center there to help the neighborhood youth. But when she passed away, Kendrick simply assumed the land belonged to him. He thought his expensive Ivy League degree entitled him to erase his mother's dream and build luxury condos for wealthy elites. He never once asked for my permission. He just used the land as collateral for a $5 million loan, assuming I was too old and clueless to ever check the county property records. He built his entire house of cards on dirt he never owned. Around 2 in the morning, my bedroom door creaked open. The brass hinges whined softly in the quiet house. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing deep and steady, simulating a heavy, exhausted sleep. I listened to the footsteps creeping across the carpet. It was a truly pathetic sound. A 40-year-old man wearing silk pajamas sneaking into his 75-year-old father's bedroom to steal from him in the dead of night. I heard him hold his breath as he approached the nightstand. There was a faint clink of metal as his manicured fingers snatched the silver key. He turned around and tiptoed out of the room, closing the door gently behind him. I opened my eyes in the dark. I did not feel anger anymore. I only felt a cold, absolute resolve. The bait was taken. The trap was set. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen drinking plain black coffee. I heard Kendrick rushing down the stairs. He did not even look in my direction. He grabbed his car keys and bolted out the front door. He was in a frantic race against time. The bank deadline was Monday morning. It was currently Sunday, but I knew he had a private wealth manager at Chase Bank who would open the vault for him on a weekend for the right amount of bribe money. I picked up my phone and called my corporate fixer, Dominic. "It is done," I told him calmly. He took the key. He is on his way to the vault right now. Dominic chuckled deeply on the other end of the line. "I have a contact at the bank monitoring the vault access," Dominic said. "He is going to let Kendrick inside. Kendrick forged your signature on a vault authorization form last night. He actually thinks he is a criminal mastermind. Let him think that," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Let him open the box." I could picture the scene perfectly in my mind. Kendrick arriving at the bank, sweating profusely through his designer suit, slipping the manager a thick envelope of cash to bypass the weekend security protocols, walking into the cold, sterile vault with the silver key gripped tightly in his sweating palm, finding box 402, turning the lock and pulling the long, heavy metal drawer out. He was expecting to find blank transfer deeds. He was expecting to find the ultimate salvation for his $5 million debt. He was expecting to find the key to keeping his $10 million mansion, his luxury cars, and his fake high society life. Instead, he found a single thick manila folder. I knew exactly what he was reading at that very moment, because I had drafted the documents with Dominic 10 years ago. When Kendrick opened the folder, he did not find transfer papers. He found a legally binding, ironclad document establishing the Sylvia Cole Irrevocable Trust. The documents explicitly stated that the entire Oakwood land parcel was transferred into this trust permanently. The legal terms were absolute and unbreakable. The land could not be sold. It could not be developed for commercial luxury use. And most importantly, it could absolutely never be used as financial collateral by anyone under any circumstances whatsoever. Kendrick was staring at a piece of paper that proved he had exactly 0 legal rights to the land he had just leveraged to a mafia-like private equity firm. He had gone to the bank expecting to steal my property. Instead, he uncovered his own financial execution. By pledging land that was locked in a blind trust, he had committed federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny. He had effectively stolen $5 million from some of the most dangerous lenders in Chicago using a completely fake asset. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from Dominic. The bank contact says Kendrick just dropped the folder on the floor of the vault. He looks like he is going to pass out. He is throwing up in the bank trash can right now. I set my phone down on the granite counter. I felt no pity in my heart. For years, I had watched him treat everyone around him like absolute garbage. I had watched him laugh at me in front of his elite friends. I had watched him auction me off for $2. Now he was standing in a bank vault realizing his entire net worth was a criminal illusion. He had a choice to make today. A smart man would confess. A smart man would go to the police, admit his massive fraud, take the bankruptcy, and face the legal consequences. But Kendrick was not a smart man. He was an arrogant, desperate man, terrified of his greedy wife and terrified of losing his fake social status. I knew he would not confess. I knew he would try to dig his way out of the grave by grabbing a bigger shovel. He would panic. And panic makes men do things that put them behind bars for a very long time. I finished my coffee, washed my mug in the sink, and walked into the living room to wait for him to return. The silent adjustment was moving exactly according to my schedule. The hook was set deep in his jaw, and he was about to tear himself apart trying to get free. I sat in the leather armchair of the dark study listening to the heavy oak front doors fly open. Kendrick stumbled into the grand foyer. He was gasping for air as if he had just run a marathon. He tripped over the expensive imported rug and crashed to his knees on the marble floor. The silver key he stole from my nightstand dropped from his trembling hand and clattered away. I stayed perfectly still in the shadows, watching my 40-year-old son have a total psychological collapse. Brittany came marching out of the formal dining room holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne. She wore a designer silk dress ready to celebrate what she thought was their financial salvation. But the moment she saw her husband sweating and hyperventilating on the floor, her arrogant smile vanished. She rushed over and grabbed his shoulder, shaking him. She demanded to know where the transfer papers were. She demanded to know if the bank was going to release the $5 million to save their mansion. Kendrick looked up at her with hollow, terrified eyes. He could barely form a coherent sentence. He kept choking on his own breath, muttering that the land was gone. He told her there were no transfer deeds in the safety deposit box. He told her about the Sylvia Cole Irrevocable Trust. He explained that his mother and I had locked that land away decades ago, and that he had absolutely zero legal rights to the property. Brittany dropped her champagne glass. It shattered into 100 pieces across the marble floor, perfectly mirroring their fragile, fake empire. She screamed at him, asking how this was possible. Kendrick began to weep. He told his wife that he had used land he did not own as collateral for a massive commercial loan from ruthless private equity lenders. He confessed that when the bank opened for business on Monday morning, they would discover the asset was completely fake. The lenders would not just foreclose on the house. They would hand the file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Kendrick cried that he was going to go to federal prison for wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny. He sobbed that his life was entirely over. I watched Brittany pace around the shattered glass on the floor. A normal wife would have comforted her husband. A decent human being would have told him to call a lawyer and confess to the authorities before things got worse. But Brittany was not a decent human being. She was a parasite driven entirely by unadulterated greed. She looked around her luxurious mansion, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the priceless art, and the imported furniture. She refused to lose her high society status. She refused to be a poor woman. She walked over to Kendrick, grabbed him by the collar of his ruined custom suit, and pulled him to his feet. She slapped him hard across the face. The sound echoed through the massive foyer. She told him to stop crying like a pathetic child. She told him there was only one way out of this disaster, and it required him to finally act like a man. Kendrick stared at her, shaking uncontrollably. He asked her what she wanted him to do. Brittany leaned in close and lowered her voice, but in the echoing foyer I could hear every single venomous word. She told him to forge my signature. Just forge the old man's signature on a quitclaim deed, she hissed, her voice dripping with desperation and malice. We can backdate the document to last year. We can bring in that shady notary from your country club, the one who owes you a favor. He will stamp it and make it look official. We file it with the county clerk first thing tomorrow morning, and we hand the receipt to the private equity lenders. It will legally transfer the land out of the trust and directly into your corporate name. Kendrick shook his head violently. He told her that was a federal felony. He said if they were caught, they would spend decades behind bars. But Brittany was relentless. She dug her manicured nails into his arms and manipulated his deepest fears. She reminded him that I was just a senile old man. She told him that I was crazy and that no judge or bank investigator would ever believe my word over the word of a wealthy, charismatic chief executive officer. She convinced him that society always sides with the young and the rich, not the old and the forgotten. She whispered that the old man was practically a ghost anyway, so stealing from a ghost did not matter. I sat in the dark study, gripping the armrests of my chair. I listened to my own son surrender the very last shred of his morality. I watched him nod his head slowly, agreeing to commit a massive crime against his own father just to save a woman who would leave him the second his bank account hit zero. They hurried off to their home office to draft the fake documents. I remained in the shadows, perfectly calm. They thought they were being clever. They did not know they were simply tying the noose around their own necks. Early the next morning, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I was sitting on the back patio drinking a cup of black coffee, watching the sun rise over the manicured lawns. I answered the call. It was Dominic, my corporate fixer and private investigator. He was parked outside the Cook County Clerk's office in downtown Chicago. Dominic spoke in his usual low, gravelly tone. "Dexter," he said, "it is happening exactly as you predicted. Kendrick just walked into the records building. He is sweating through his shirt and clutching a manila envelope. He has the shady notary right by his side. They are approaching the filing window right now to submit the forged quitclaim deed." Dominic paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle between us. He knew the legal implications better than anyone. He knew that the moment that fake deed was stamped and entered into the county registry, a massive, irreversible crime would be officially documented. Dexter, Dominic asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "I have 2 security guards with me. I can walk into that building right now, intercept the paperwork, and shut this entire thing down before he hands it over to the clerk. Just say the word and I will stop him. I can save him from making the biggest mistake of his miserable life." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked out at the massive estate my son had bought with stolen money and false promises. I thought about the 30 years I spent breaking my back on construction sites just to give him a better life. I thought about the moment he stood on a stage and auctioned my dignity off for $2 while his wife laughed at my frayed suit. I thought about him plotting to drug me with a fake doctor just to steal my legacy. I thought about my late wife Sylvia and how much she loved that piece of land, hoping to build a community center for the neighborhood youth. Kendrick wanted to pave over her beautiful dream with stolen concrete and fake luxury condos. I held the phone close to my mouth and spoke with absolute freezing clarity. "No," I told Dominic, "do not stop him. Let him walk up to that window. Let him hand that forged paper to the government clerk. Let them file it. Let my son commit a federal felony." Dominic let out a low, appreciative chuckle. "Understood, Mr. Cole," he replied. "The trap is officially set. I will secure a certified copy of the forged deed the second it enters the public record. Enjoy your morning." I ended the call and set the phone down on the patio table. There is a profound difference between teaching a boy a lesson and watching a man destroy himself. I had tried to teach Kendrick the value of hard work and honesty for decades. He rejected every lesson. Now he was a grown man choosing to cross the point of no return. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the cold satisfaction of a builder watching a condemned building getting ready for demolition. When Kendrick returned to the mansion later that afternoon, his entire demeanor had drastically changed. The sweating, hyperventilating coward from the day before was completely gone. In his place was the arrogant, smug chief executive officer. He walked through the front doors with his chest puffed out and a sickening smile plastered across his face. Brittany greeted him in the foyer with a glass of expensive champagne. They clinked their glasses together and laughed a loud, triumphant laugh. They truly believed they had won. They believed they had outsmarted the system, outsmarted the bank, and outsmarted the foolish old man who lived down the hall. I watched them from the top of the stairs as they celebrated their grand felony. They were utterly intoxicated by their own hubris. Brittany loudly praised Kendrick, calling him a genius and a true visionary. She bragged about how she was going to buy a new diamond necklace to celebrate their victory. Kendrick boasted that the private equity lenders had accepted the filed deed receipt and had officially approved the massive loan extension. He was convinced his empire was absolutely secure. They immediately shifted their focus to the biggest event of their social calendar. The highly publicized groundbreaking ceremony for the Oakwood luxury development project was scheduled for the very next morning. It was meant to be Kendrick's crowning achievement, the moment he proved to the entire city of Chicago that he was a titan of commercial real estate. I listened as they frantically coordinated with event planners over the phone. They ordered massive floral arrangements, imported caviar, and a premium open bar for the very important guests. They confirmed the attendance of the city mayor, 3 prominent aldermen, and their wealthiest primary investors. Kendrick even ordered customized golden shovels with his name engraved on the handles for the ceremonial dirt turning. They were setting the stage for a spectacular display of wealth and power. They did not invite me to the ceremony, but they made sure to loudly discuss the details whenever I walked past them in the hallway. They wanted to rub their fake success in my face. They wanted me to know that my land was gone, and that they had built a shiny new future on the ashes of my dead wife's dream. I simply nodded and kept walking. I went to my room, selected a clean dark suit, and polished my old leather shoes. I did not need an invitation to attend a groundbreaking ceremony on land that legally and rightfully belonged to me. As night fell over the mansion, I could hear Kendrick and Brittany laughing and playing loud music in the grand dining room. They were drinking expensive wine and toasting to their brilliant forgery. They thought the storm had passed. They had absolutely no idea that the darkest, heaviest clouds were gathering right above their heads. They thought tomorrow morning would bring them glory and endless riches. They did not know they were meticulously setting up the stage for their own brutal public execution. The golden shovels were polished, the mayor was coming, and the trap was perfectly primed. Tomorrow, the entire city of Chicago would watch my son fall. The morning air in Chicago was biting and crisp, but the atmosphere at the Oakwood Project site was thick with fake warmth and expensive perfume. I stood at the very back of the massive crowd with my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I wore my old wool coat. It was the exact same coat I used to wear when my late wife Sylvia and I bought this exact plot of dirt 40 years ago. Back then, it was just an empty lot filled with broken glass, wild weeds, and discarded tires. Sylvia saw a beautiful community center here. She wanted a safe place for the neighborhood kids to learn and grow. Today, my son Kendrick saw nothing but a giant automated teller machine. He had transformed her humble dream into a grotesque circus of greed. White event tents were set up across the uneven ground, blowing slightly in the cold wind. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black bow ties carried heavy silver trays loaded with imported caviar and flutes of crystal-clear champagne. The attendees were the absolute peak of the Chicago elite. Real estate tycoons, corrupt city aldermen, and wealthy private equity investors were all mingling and laughing loudly. They patted each other on the back and talked about profit margins and gentrification. They had absolutely no idea they were standing on a massive federal crime scene. Camera shutters clicked like rapid gunfire from the press pit. Flashbulbs popped blindingly bright against the gray morning sky. Up on the raised wooden stage stood my 40-year-old son. Kendrick was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most families in this South Side neighborhood made in an entire year. In his manicured hands, he held a ridiculous golden shovel. It gleamed brightly under the camera lights. That shovel was a perfect symbol of his entire life. It was shiny on the outside, but completely useless for any actual hard work. Brittany stood right beside him. She wore a pristine white designer coat and a smile so wide and fake, it looked physically painful. She was beaming for the cameras, soaking in the attention like a desperate sponge. She positioned herself perfectly right next to the mayor of Chicago, making sure every single photographer captured her good side. Just 24 hours ago, she was screaming like a maniac in her grand foyer, pushing her husband to commit a major federal felony. Today, she was playing the role of the perfect high society wife. She looked like royalty. I knew she was about to become a peasant. Kendrick stepped up to the wooden podium and tapped the microphone. The electronic feedback whined for a second before the crowd settled down into an eager, respectful silence. Kendrick flashed his million-dollar smile at the audience. "Thank you all for coming out today," he began, his voice echoing loudly over the large rented speakers. "Today is a monumental day for Cole Holdings. When I started this company, I had absolutely nothing but a vision and an unstoppable work ethic. I looked around this neglected neighborhood and I saw potential. I built this empire from the ground up, completely self-made. I poured my own blood, sweat, and tears into securing this land so we could bring luxury and progress to the South Side." I listened to his arrogant lies from the back row without moving a single muscle. He did not mention my name. He did not mention the $100,000 of my hard-earned money I gave him to start his firm. He certainly did not mention his mother Sylvia, who actually saved the pennies to buy the ground he was currently standing on. He just kept spinning his fairy tale, feeding his own massive ego and impressing the greedy investors sitting in the front row. But fairy tales always come to a bitter end. Right as Kendrick finished his speech, he raised his golden shovel high into the air, preparing to turn the first pile of ceremonial dirt. The crowd began to clap. Then a piercing sound cut entirely through the cold morning air. It was the sharp, deafening wail of police sirens. The sound multiplied, echoing off the surrounding brick buildings and shaking the ground. 3 black unmarked sport utility vehicles sped past the security barricades, tearing through the yellow caution tape. They slammed on their brakes, right at the edge of the red carpet, sending gravel flying into the air. The flashing red and blue lights painted the pristine white event tents in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. The crowd of wealthy investors and politicians stopped clapping immediately. A low murmur of confusion rippled through the hundreds of seated guests. Up on the stage, Kendrick froze completely solid. His golden shovel hovered awkwardly in the air. The confident smile melted off his face like wax placed too close to a fire. Brittany dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the wooden stairs, allowing the expensive alcohol to spill all over her designer white shoes. The heavy doors of the black vehicle swung open in unison. Out stepped Dominic. My corporate fixer looked like a towering executioner in his dark tailored suit. He was not alone. He was flanked by 4 large men wearing navy blue windbreakers with large yellow letters printed clearly across their backs. The letters read FBI. 2 more men stepped out behind them wearing official badges from the State Banking Regulation Authority. Dominic did not wait for an invitation. He did not care about the cameras. He marched right up the center aisle of the folding chairs. His heavy footsteps crunched aggressively against the gravel and the red carpet. The crowd of wealthy elites parted instantly, scrambling to get out of his way. Nobody in that audience wanted to stand in the path of angry federal agents. The air was sucked completely out of the venue. The only sound left was the low, aggressive hum of the idling vehicles and the heavy, nervous breathing of the panicked crowd. Kendrick stared down at Dominic with eyes as wide as saucers. His hands began to shake so violently the golden shovel actually rattled against his pant leg. Dominic did not stop his march until he walked directly up the wooden stairs and stepped onto the stage. He walked right past the mayor of Chicago, who was already backing away with a look of sheer political terror. Dominic stood directly in front of Kendrick. He reached out his massive hand and simply plucked the microphone right out of my son's trembling fingers. Kendrick did not resist at all. He looked like he was about to pass out right there on the wooden boards. Dominic turned to face the hundreds of confused investors, the shocked politicians, and the flashing cameras of the local press. This project is suspended indefinitely, Dominic announced, his deep, booming voice echoing across the silent lot. The crowd gasped collectively. Reporters began shouting questions, but Dominic ignored them. He pulled a folded legal document from his inside jacket pocket and held it up high for the cameras to capture. The collateral deed filed yesterday morning with the county clerk is a blatant forgery, Dominic stated firmly, his words cutting like a knife. The man standing on this stage used a fraudulent document to illegally leverage this property for a $5 million commercial loan. Dominic turned his head slowly and locked his cold eyes directly with Kendrick. The true owner of this land, Mr. Dexter Cole, has never signed away his rights, and he is officially pressing criminal charges for grand larceny and wire fraud. Total and complete chaos erupted instantly. The mayor of Chicago practically sprinted off the back of the stage, pushing past a catering waiter to get to his waiting black limousine. He knew a toxic public relations disaster when he saw one, and he was not going down with a sinking ship. The primary investors, the men in the expensive suits who had praised Kendrick just 5 minutes ago, jumped out of their seats and began shouting in absolute fury. They screamed about their lost money. They demanded immediate answers. They cursed Kendrick's name loudly. But Kendrick could not speak a single word. His mouth hung open, catching flies. His chest heaved up and down in a full-blown panic attack. The shiny golden shovel slipped from his sweaty grip and hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, heavy clang. It sounded exactly like the final bell of a boxing match he had just severely lost. He was entirely broken. Down in the VIP seating area, a man in a cheap gray suit tried to quietly slip out of his folding chair and sneak toward the back exit. It was the shady notary from the country club, the corrupt man who had stamped the fake deed for a quick bribe just 24 hours ago. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 federal agents charged through the rows of folding chairs. They tackled him hard against a catering table, sending trays of expensive smoked salmon crashing into the dirt. They yanked his arms violently behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed clearly over the shouting crowd. Kendrick watched his criminal accomplice get dragged away through the dirt. He knew he was next. He knew his entire fake life was completely over. Brittany was hyperventilating on the stage. Her pristine, upper-class image was destroyed forever. She looked wildly around the screaming crowd, her eyes darting like a trapped rat, desperately searching for a way out. And then she looked all the way to the back of the lot, her panicked, terrified eyes locked directly onto mine. I was still standing there at the edge of the property with my arms crossed, my posture completely relaxed. I did not smile. I did not gloat or cheer. I simply raised my right hand, touched the brim of my old wool hat, and tipped it to her in a slow, deliberate gesture of farewell. Brittany let out a suppressed, horrified shriek. She finally understood everything. She realized that the poor old man she had tormented, the man she tried to throw into a mental asylum, had orchestrated this entire public execution. She grabbed Kendrick's arm, digging her sharp nails into his expensive suit, and violently yanked him off the back of the stage. They did not answer the screaming reporters who shoved microphones in their faces. They did not apologize to the furious investors who grabbed at their clothes. They scrambled blindly through the dirt, shoving past the confused caterers, and sprinted toward their luxury sports car parked on the street. They threw themselves into the vehicle, and the tires screeched loudly against the asphalt. They sped away, running red lights, leaving a massive cloud of gray dust and absolute disgrace behind them. I watched their car disappear around the corner. The flashing blue and red lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the abandoned stage and the dropped golden shovel. The crowd was still screaming, but I felt nothing but a profound, quiet peace. They thought they were running away to figure out a new plan, but I knew the brutal truth. Their credit cards were already frozen. Their assets were locked. They had nowhere left to run. The heavy doors of the trap had officially snapped shut. The tires of Kendrick's sports car left thick black skid marks on the pristine driveway of the $10 million mansion. They had fled the groundbreaking ceremony like common thieves running from a crime scene. I did not rush to follow them. I took a slow, quiet taxi back to the estate. I wanted to give the poison enough time to circulate through their veins. I wanted the absolute reality of their situation to fully set in before I walked through the front door. By the time I stepped out of the taxi and walked up the long paved driveway, the financial execution was already well underway. I walked quietly into the grand foyer. The massive house was a chaotic echo chamber of ringing phones and frantic screaming. Kendrick was pacing back and forth in the formal dining room, holding his cell phone so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was shouting at his private wealth manager at Chase Bank. I stood in the shadows of the hallway listening to the glorious sound of his empire crumbling into dust. Kendrick was begging the bank manager to release just $50,000 to cover an emergency legal retainer. He was sweating through his ruined custom suit. The response he got from the other end of the line made his knees buckle. The bank manager informed him that every single corporate account under Cole Holdings was frozen by a federal mandate. The private equity lenders had officially triggered the default clauses. His personal accounts were locked. His credit lines were zeroed out. The fraud investigation was active, and the federal authorities were already preparing the asset seizure warrants. Kendrick dropped his phone onto the marble floor. It cracked the screen, but he did not even notice. He collapsed into a dining chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. He was officially a penniless man. But Brittany was not crying with him. Brittany was a creature of pure survival instinct. The moment she smelled the poverty, she immediately began searching for the nearest exit. I walked silently up the sweeping marble staircase, following the sound of heavy objects being thrown around in the master bedroom. I stood just outside the open doorway and watched her operate. She had dragged 3 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases out of her walk-in closet and thrown them onto the king-sized bed. She was not packing her wedding album. She was not packing family photos or sentimental keepsakes. She was frantically throwing designer dresses, cashmere sweaters, and every piece of diamond jewelry she could find into the expensive leather bags. She was moving with the frantic energy of a rat abandoning a sinking ship. Kendrick stumbled up the stairs and walked into the bedroom. He looked like a walking corpse. He saw the suitcases and his eyes widened in absolute confusion. He asked Brittany what she was doing, his voice cracking and hollow. He told her they had to call the lawyers and figure out a defense strategy because the bank was going to take the house and everything else. Brittany did not even stop packing. She snatched a handful of silk scarves and shoved them into the suitcase. "There is no we, Kendrick," she snapped, her voice cold and entirely devoid of affection. "You committed a federal felony. You forged a legal document and got caught by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in front of the mayor. I am not going down with you. I am not spending the best years of my life visiting you through a glass window in a federal penitentiary." Kendrick stumbled forward, reaching out to touch her arm. He pleaded with her tears streaming down his face, reminding her that she was his wife and that they took vows. He begged her not to leave him alone. She ripped her arm away from his grasp as if he carried a contagious disease. Vows do not pay for luxury penthouses, Kendrick. I am leaving. I am going to Paris until this entire humiliating scandal blows over. I have friends there. I can start over. You are on your own. I watched from the hallway as she zipped up the first suitcase and dragged her silver laptop onto the bed. She opened the airline website with trembling fingers. She rapidly typed in the information for a one-way first-class ticket to Paris, France. The total cost was over $8,000. She did not blink. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her heavy metal black American Express card. She confidently typed the 16-digit number into the payment portal. She clicked purchase and waited for the confirmation screen. I leaned against the doorframe, perfectly calm. I knew exactly what was about to happen on that computer screen. Early this morning, while they were busy picking out their outfits for the groundbreaking ceremony, I had made a very brief phone call to Dominic. As the true majority shareholder of Cole Holdings, I had total executive control over the corporate accounts. I instructed Dominic to revoke Brittany's authorized user status on the black card. I told him to cut off every single line of credit attached to her name. Brittany stared at the laptop screen. A red error message popped up indicating the transaction was declined. She frowned, letting out an irritated sigh. She muttered something about bank fraud protection algorithms and rapidly typed the numbers in again. She clicked purchase for the second time. The same red error message appeared. Declined. Her hands began to shake. She pulled out a different credit card, a platinum Visa, and typed the numbers in frantically. She clicked the button. Declined. She pulled out a third card, then a fourth. Declined. 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 Brittany slammed her hands down on the keyboard. Her breathing became heavy and erratic. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed the premium customer service number for the black card. She put the phone on speaker and tapped her foot aggressively against the hardwood floor. A polite customer service representative answered the call. "This is Brittany Cole," she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "My card is being declined for a simple flight purchase. Fix it immediately or I will have your job." The representative paused for a moment, typing on their keyboard. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Miss Cole," the representative said smoothly. "However, looking at the account, I see that your authorized user status was permanently revoked this morning by the primary account holder, Mr. Dexter Cole. The account is completely closed to you. Have a wonderful day." The line went dead. The silence in the master bedroom was absolute. Brittany slowly lowered the phone. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had no money. She had no escape route. She was completely and utterly trapped in a burning building of her own making. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and walked right into the master bedroom. Brittany spun around and saw me standing there. The look on her face was a mixture of pure shock and unadulterated hatred. I did not smile. I simply looked at the closed laptop and the expensive suitcases. "It looks like your trip to Paris has been permanently canceled, Brittany," I said, my voice low and steady. "You cannot run away using my money." The last remaining thread of Brittany's sanity snapped completely. The pristine, elegant high society mask she had worn for years shattered into a million jagged pieces. The sophisticated charity gala hostess disappeared, and the ugly, greedy parasite hiding underneath finally showed her true face. She let out a guttural scream of pure rage. She turned away from me and launched herself directly at Kendrick. She raised her hand and slapped him across the face with so much force that the sound cracked like a whip. Kendrick stumbled backward, holding his reddening cheek, looking at his wife in absolute horror. "You worthless, pathetic loser," Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. "You promised me an empire. You promised me endless wealth and power, and you could not even outsmart a senile old man who belongs in a nursing home." Kendrick tried to speak, tried to calm her down, but she would not let him get a single word out. She backed him into the corner of the room, unleashing a torrent of vile, disgusting insults. Every polite filter was gone. The ugly, racist truth she had harbored in her dark heart came pouring out for the world to see. "I wasted my youth on a useless black failure," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger right in his face. "Do you really think I loved you? Do you really think I wanted to be tied to someone like you? I only married you because of the money, Kendrick. I married you because you told me you owned this entire city. You paraded me around your country clubs like a queen while you were secretly begging your daddy for permission to breathe. You are nothing but a massive disappointment. You dragged me down into the mud with you, and now I have absolutely nothing because you are too stupid to run a simple real estate scam." Kendrick fell to his knees weeping. The woman he had worshipped, the woman he had committed a federal felony for, was standing over him and verbally destroying every ounce of his humanity. He had abandoned his father to please a woman who saw him as nothing more than a walking bank account. And now that the account was empty, she was looking at him like he was a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of her expensive shoe.
"I am ruined because of you,"
she sobbed hysterically, kicking his leg. "You ruined my life. I am going to be the laughingstock of Chicago. My friends will never speak to me again. I hate you, Kendrick. I absolutely hate you." I did not intervene. I did not raise my voice to defend my son. I simply stood by the doorway with my arms at my sides. But my hands were not empty. I was holding my smartphone. The camera lens was pointed directly at Brittany, capturing her violent physical assault and recording every single racist, degrading word that came spewing out of her mouth. The red recording circle blinked steadily on my screen. I was capturing the undeniable proof of her true character. This was not just a tantrum. This was the ultimate weapon I would use to absolutely annihilate her in any courtroom she dared to step into. She was openly admitting that the marriage was a financial fraud. She was committing domestic assault. She was showing her true bigoted colors. I watched my son weeping on the floor, broken and humiliated by his own choices. He had auctioned me off for $2. Now he was paying the ultimate price. I stopped the recording and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The real punishment was just about to begin. Brittany stormed past me, her designer heels stomping against the hardwood floor with the frantic energy of a fleeing criminal. She brushed my shoulder violently, but I did not move an inch. The heavy bedroom door slammed shut behind her, shaking the picture frames on the walls. The loud echo of that slamming door was the sound of a toxic marriage officially collapsing into dust. I stepped further into the master bedroom. The room was a disaster of scattered silk ties, dumped jewelry boxes, and overturned chairs. And right in the center of that expensive wreckage was my 40-year-old son. Kendrick was no longer the arrogant chief executive officer who stood on a stage and laughed at my frayed suit. He was no longer the charismatic socialite who raised a champagne glass and mocked the father who gave him everything. He was completely stripped of his false power. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket was torn at the shoulder from where his wife had violently grabbed him. His silk bow tie hung loosely around his neck like a broken noose. He stood there staring at the empty doorway where the woman he committed a federal felony for had just abandoned him. Slowly he turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot and completely hollow. The sheer terror of federal prison was finally breaking his mind. He realized that the wealthy friends who drank his imported wine were gone. The politicians he bribed were gone. The viciously greedy wife he tried to satisfy was packing her bags to leave him to the wolves. I was the absolute only person left in the room. I was the very man he had thrown to the bottom of the social ladder. His knees buckled. It was not a slow descent. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor with a heavy thud. He crawled toward me, his hands pressing flat against the polished stone. He grabbed the hem of my worn trousers, wrapping his arms around my legs. He began to sob uncontrollably. It was a pathetic, gut-wrenching sound. He wept like a frightened child, begging for salvation from a nightmare he had built with his own two hands. "Daddy, please." He choked out the words, struggling to breathe through his panic. "Please, Daddy, you have to help me. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. They are going to lock me in a federal cell for decades. The private equity lenders are going to destroy me. They will take my freedom. They will take my life. Please use the $2 million. Use your company accounts. Bail me out. I will do whatever you want. I will pay you back every single cent. Just do not let them put me in a cage." I looked down at the top of his head. I felt the physical weight of my grown son clinging to my legs, pleading for his life. 40 years ago, I held him in my arms and promised his mother, Sylvia, that I would make sure he grew into an honorable man. I worked 3 jobs laying bricks in the freezing Chicago winters just to make sure he never had to beg anyone for anything. And here he was begging on his knees because he chose greed over honor. I did not reach down to comfort him. I did not place a hand on his shoulder. I stood as rigid as a statue, letting his tears soak the fabric of my old shoes. $2, Kendrick, I said, my voice dropping into a low, resonant register that filled the quiet bedroom. I want you to remember that exact number. $2. That was the absolute maximum value you placed on my dignity last night. You stood on a brightly lit stage in front of 250 people and you auctioned off the man who wiped your tears and paid your Harvard tuition. You smiled while your elite friends laughed at my worn clothes. You decided I was nothing but a useless old relic. Kendrick squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head frantically against my legs. "No?" he sobbed loudly. "It was just a stupid joke. It was the alcohol. I was trying to impress them. I did not mean it." "You meant every single word," I replied coldly. You meant it when you forged my signature on a legal deed to steal the land your mother and I bought with our blood. You meant it when you brought a disgraced doctor into my home to drug me into a mental asylum. You did not care if I died alone in a psychiatric ward as long as you got to keep your mansion and your luxury cars. He wailed, clutching his chest as the reality of his actions crushed his lungs. I am a monster, he cried out, hitting his fist against the marble floor. I know I am a monster, but please do not let me rot in prison. You are a billionaire. $5 million is nothing to you. You can wipe out this debt with one phone call to the bank. Please, Daddy, save me. I stepped backward, forcing him to let go of my legs. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold stone. I am not going to pay your debt, Kendrick, I stated flatly. I am not going to wire $5 million to a corrupt private equity firm just so you can keep pretending to be a real estate mogul. I am not going to finance the lavish lifestyle of a criminal. Kendrick gasped, looking up at me with sheer panic. Then I am dead, he whispered. The federal agents have the forged deed. The bank will press maximum charges by Monday morning. My life is entirely over. I looked down at him. I did not say I was letting you go to prison, I corrected him slowly, letting the words sink into his panicked brain. I said I am not paying off your debt. But I will do something else. I will have Dominic contact the private equity lenders first thing on Monday morning. I will purchase the entire $5 million loan directly from them. I will transfer the debt portfolio under my own holding company. Kendrick blinked, his tear-filled eyes, struggling to understand the corporate maneuver. What does that mean? He asked, his voice trembling. It means the bank will no longer be coming after you, I explained. It means the federal investigators will stand down because the defrauded party is no longer a commercial institution. It means I am buying your debt. I will become your sole creditor. You will owe the $5 million directly to me. And as the victim of your forged quitclaim deed, I am the only person who can choose whether or not to press criminal forgery charges against you. A small glimmer of desperate hope sparked in his bloodshot eyes. You will drop the charges, he asked, pulling himself up to his knees. You will save me from prison. I will drop the federal charges, I confirmed, my tone freezing any warmth in the room. But my salvation does not come for free, Kendrick. You are going to pay back every single penny of that $5 million, and you are going to do it exactly on my terms. I paced slowly around the ruined bedroom, outlining the brutal architecture of his new reality. I have 3 conditions, I told him. If you fail to meet even one of them, I will walk straight to the district attorney, hand over the original forged documents, and watch the judge sentence you to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Kendrick nodded furiously, his hands clasped together in prayer. Anything, he begged. Name it. Condition number 1, I said, stopping right in front of him. You will file for an absolute divorce from Brittany immediately. You will sign a separation agreement stating that she leaves this marriage with exactly what she brought into it, which is absolutely nothing. She will not get a single cent of alimony from my family wealth. You will cut that parasite out of our lives permanently. He swallowed hard but nodded without hesitation. Yes, he agreed quickly. Done. Condition number 2, I continued. You will sign over full legal and physical custody of my 7-year-old grandson Malik directly to me. You and Brittany have proven yourselves to be morally bankrupt criminals. I will not allow you to poison that boy with your greed. I will raise Malik in my home where he will learn the value of honesty and hard work. You will have no legal authority over him whatsoever. Kendrick closed his eyes, a fresh wave of tears falling down his cheeks. Giving up his son was the ultimate defeat, but he knew he had absolutely no leverage. He knew a federal prison cell was the only other option. I will sign the custody papers, he whispered, his head bowed in total submission. And condition number 3, I said, my voice growing louder, commanding the entire space. You owe me $5 million. You are going to pay it back through manual labor. The Oakwood project site now belongs entirely to my trust. It is no longer a luxury condominium project. I am converting it into affordable housing for the Southside community. Starting Monday morning, you will report to that construction site at 6 in the morning. You will wear a hard hat and steel-toed boots. You will grab a shovel and you will clear the debris with your own 2 hands. You will work for minimum wage as a general laborer under my site foreman until the debt is paid in full. There will be no corner office. There will be no tailored suits. You will learn exactly how much a dollar is worth by breaking your back in the dirt. Kendrick stared at me, completely paralyzed. The thought of performing brutal physical labor in front of the very people he used to boss around was a humiliation worse than anything he could have imagined. But the alternative was wearing an orange jumpsuit for the rest of his life. He slowly lowered his head until his forehead touched the marble floor again. "I accept your terms," he cried out, his spirit entirely broken. "I will do the work. Just please do not let them take me away." Suddenly, a loud, aggressive crash came from the hallway. The heavy bedroom door swung open, revealing Brittany. She had not left for the airport yet. She had been standing in the shadows of the corridor, listening to every single word of my brutal ultimatum. Her designer suitcase was dropped carelessly on the floor behind her. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure demonic fury. "You must be out of your miserable mind," she shrieked, storming into the room and pointing her manicured finger directly at my chest. "You think you can just force him to divorce me and leave me with nothing? You think you can just steal my child and throw me out onto the street like garbage?" I turned to face her, feeling absolutely no intimidation. "I did not steal anything, Brittany," I replied smoothly. "You are the one who just packed your bags to abandon your husband and your son to flee to Paris. I am simply making your departure permanent." She marched up to me, her chest heaving with rage. She looked down at her weeping husband on the floor and then glared at me with absolute venom. "I am his legal wife," she spat out. "I am entitled to half of everything he owns, including the assets in his family line. You have millions of dollars hidden away. Dexter and I am going to take my rightful share. I am going to hire the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state of Illinois." She threatened, her voice echoing loudly in the high ceilings. "I am going to drag you into family court and expose you as a manipulative, abusive old tyrant who orchestrated a conspiracy to ruin my life. I will take 50% of your entire estate. I will take full custody of Malik and demand thousands in child support. I will destroy your reputation, and I will burn your precious legacy to the ground." I looked at her furious, trembling face. I thought about the video currently sitting safely in my phone. The video where she violently assaulted her husband and screamed racist, degrading insults, admitting she only married him for his money. She thought she was going to wage a legal war against me. She had absolutely no idea she was walking blindfolded right into a courtroom execution. I tipped my head slightly, giving her a cold, unbothered smile. "I strongly suggest you hire a very good lawyer, Brittany," I told her, my voice echoing with quiet authority. "Because you are going to need a miracle to survive what I have waiting for you in court." She spun around, grabbed her designer suitcase, and stormed down the hallway, screaming obscenities into the air. The battle lines were officially drawn, and the final stage of the silent adjustment was about to begin. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, just 3 weeks after the disastrous, groundbreaking ceremony. I was sitting at the kitchen island in my new, highly secure home, drinking a cup of plain black coffee, while my grandson Malik was safely asleep down the hall. My corporate fixer Dominic walked through the front door and dropped a thick stack of printed papers right onto the granite counter. He did not say a word at first. He just tapped his heavy finger against the top page. It was a printout from a very popular, very vicious Chicago gossip blog known for destroying the reputations of the city elite. I put my coffee mug down and read the headline. It was written in massive bold letters designed to grab maximum attention. The headline read, "The Tyrant of Oakwood, How a Secret Billionaire Father-in-Law Destroyed a Chicago Power Couple to Steal Their Child." I did not even flinch. I simply adjusted my reading glasses and read through the article. Brittany had not wasted a single second. Acting on pure survival instinct and unadulterated greed, she had gone straight to the gutter press. She had given them an exclusive anonymous interview, though anyone with half a brain knew exactly who the source was. In the article, she painted a masterful, beautifully tragic picture of herself. She claimed she was the devoted, loving wife of a struggling young entrepreneur. She spun a massive lie that Kendrick and I had secretly conspired to ruin her life. She told the blog that I was a tyrannical, abusive old man who hid his massive wealth from his own family just to watch them suffer in poverty. She accused me of staging the federal raid at the groundbreaking ceremony to humiliate her and force her out of the family so I could kidnap her 7-year-old son. Dominic stood across the kitchen island, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was a mask of cold, professional fury. "Dexter," he said, his voice rumbling low in his throat, "I have our legal team on standby. We can file a massive defamation lawsuit by noon. We can completely bankrupt this gossip blog and force them to issue a public retraction by the end of the week. This is a direct attack on your character and your corporate legacy." I looked at the printed article and let out a soft, dry chuckle. I picked up the papers and calmly tossed them into the kitchen trash can. "No, Dominic," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "We are not going to sue a worthless gossip blog. We are not going to issue a public statement, and we are definitely not going to defend my character to a bunch of strangers on the internet. Let her talk. Let her scream from the rooftops. Let her build her house of cards as high as she possibly wants. The higher she builds it, the harder she is going to hit the concrete when I knock it down. Dominic nodded slowly, a small, grim smile appearing on his face. He understood the strategy perfectly. When an enemy is making a massive mistake, you never interrupt them. You simply hand them a bigger shovel and watch them dig their own grave. 2 days later, the real attack began. A process server showed up at my front gate and handed the security guard a massive legal binder. Brittany had officially filed a lawsuit in the Cook County Family Court. She had not hired just any lawyer. She had hired Richard Sterling. Sterling was a sleazy, high-profile divorce attorney known throughout Chicago for representing wealthy, scorned wives. He was a shark who wore cheap cologne and expensive watches, a man who specialized in bleeding rich families dry through endless media manipulation and aggressive court tactics. Dominic and I sat in my home office and reviewed the lawsuit. It was an absolute masterpiece of legal fiction. Brittany was suing both me and Kendrick simultaneously. She was demanding a full 50% of the entire Cole estate. Her lawyer argued that because Kendrick was my son and had worked for my holding company, my massive corporate wealth was technically commingled with their marital assets. She was claiming that the millions of dollars locked in the Sylvia Cole Irrevocable Trust rightfully belonged to her because she had unknowingly supported Kendrick's business endeavors. But her financial demands were just the beginning. She was demanding $20,000 a month in permanent alimony, claiming she had become accustomed to a specific lifestyle and could no longer work due to the severe emotional distress I had allegedly caused her. Furthermore, she was demanding full absolute legal and physical custody of my grandson Malik. She asked the court to grant her $10,000 a month in child support and requested a permanent restraining order to prevent me from ever seeing the boy again. I closed the thick legal binder and leaned back in my leather chair. It was almost poetic in its delusion. She had walked out of a $10 million mansion with nothing but a suitcase full of stolen designer clothes and a head full of racist hatred, and now she believed she could use the legal system to extort me for half of my life savings. She thought the legal system was a weapon she could wield against an old man. She did not realize that a courtroom is a place based on hard evidence, and I held the most devastating piece of evidence imaginable. For the next 4 weeks, Dominic and I prepared for family court in absolute total silence. We completely ignored the media circus. Brittany made several appearances on local podcasts, crying fake tears and talking about the trauma of financial abuse. She went on a local morning television show dressed in modest, inexpensive clothing, looking completely exhausted to sell her victim narrative to the housewives of Chicago. She talked about how her cruel father-in-law had locked her out of her own home and stolen her baby. She painted me as a monster. The public ate it up. The court of public opinion had already convicted me. Kendrick, meanwhile, was living a completely different reality. He was waking up at 5 in the morning every single day, putting on his steel-toed boots and taking a bus to the Oakwood construction site. He was shoveling dirt and clearing debris for minimum wage, working off his $5 million debt to me, exactly as we agreed. I visited the site once a week. I never spoke to him. I just watched him sweat in the freezing Chicago wind. He was losing weight. His hands were covered in thick blisters. The arrogant chief executive officer was entirely dead. When the divorce papers were served to him at the construction site, he signed them on the hood of a dirt-covered pickup truck without a single word of protest. He knew he had no right to fight. The silence from our side drove Brittany and her sleazy lawyer absolutely crazy. They expected me to offer a massive multi-million-dollar settlement just to keep the scandal out of the public record. They expected me to protect my corporate reputation by writing a fat check and making them go away. When no settlement offer arrived, Richard Sterling filed aggressive motions demanding emergency hearings. He wanted to get in front of a judge as quickly as possible to secure temporary alimony and immediate custody of Malik. I told Dominic to grant them the expedited hearing. It was time to put an end to the circus. The day of the family court hearing finally arrived. The sky over downtown Chicago was heavy with gray storm clouds perfectly matching the grim atmosphere inside the massive courthouse building. Dominic and I walked through the metal detectors and took the elevator up to the 7th floor. The hallway outside the courtroom was packed with hungry reporters holding microphones and flashing cameras. They had been tipped off by Brittany's lawyer. They shouted questions at me, asking if I had hidden billions from my family, asking if I felt guilty for leaving my daughter-in-law on the street. I did not look at them. I did not utter a single syllable. I kept my head high, my posture perfectly straight, and walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. The room was cold and intimidating, smelling of old wood and floor wax. Brittany was already sitting at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, Richard Sterling. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She wore a simple conservative gray dress with absolutely no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she wore zero makeup to emphasize the dark circles under her eyes. She held a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hands, occasionally dabbing at her dry eyes as if she were overwhelmed by the trauma of just being in the same room as me. Richard Sterling stood next to her, leaning confidently against the table, tapping an expensive gold pen against his legal pad. He looked at me with a smug, predatory smile. He truly believed he had me completely cornered. He believed he was about to secure a multi-million-dollar payday that would make him rich. Dominic and I took our seats at the defense table. We did not bring a massive cart full of legal boxes. We did not bring a team of junior associates. Dominic simply placed one slim manila folder and a sleek silver tablet on the table in front of us. That was all we needed. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and Judge Harper walked into the courtroom. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman in her early 60s, known for her absolute intolerance of domestic abuse and financial manipulation. She took her seat, arranged her robes, and looked out over the courtroom. Her eyes lingered on Brittany with a hint of genuine sympathy. Then she turned her gaze toward me. Her expression hardened instantly. It was clear she had read the gossip blogs. It was clear she had seen the morning television interviews. She looked at me exactly the way society looks at a rich, powerful man accused of crushing a vulnerable young mother. "Are we ready to proceed, counsel?" Judge Harper asked, her voice echoing sharply across the quiet room. Richard Sterling stood up immediately, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor, we are more than ready. We are here today to request immediate emergency spousal support, a freezing of the Cole estate assets, and the immediate return of my client's minor child who was unlawfully removed from her care by the defendant, Mr. Dexter Cole." Judge Harper nodded, making a note on her legal pad. She looked directly at Dominic, who was sitting calmly beside me, and the defense she asked, her tone dripping with judicial skepticism. "Are you prepared to respond to these extremely serious allegations today?" Dominic stood up, his massive frame demanding absolute respect in the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice smooth and deeply resonant. "We are fully prepared. In fact, we will not need to call a single witness to the stand today. We believe the plaintiff has already provided all the testimony this court will ever need to make a final ruling." Brittany paused, her fake crying, for a fraction of a second. She lowered the crumpled tissue from her face and shot a quick, confused glance at her lawyer. Richard Sterling frowned, his smug smile faltering just a bit. He did not understand the strategy. He expected a long, drawn-out battle over financial documents and trust fund technicalities. He did not expect us to surrender the floor so quickly. I sat perfectly still in my wooden chair, looking straight ahead at the judge. The trap had been baited for weeks. Brittany had spent a month building a massive, beautiful house of cards based entirely on her own lies and her own fake victimhood. She had convinced the media, the public, and perhaps even the judge that she was a saint who was destroyed by a monster. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I felt the familiar, smooth shape of my smartphone resting against the fabric. I thought about the video saved securely on the hard drive. I thought about the violent slap, the screaming, and the vicious, racist insults she had hurled at my son in the grand foyer of their mansion. I thought about her explicitly admitting that she only married into my family to steal our wealth. Judge Harper leaned forward, clasping her hands together on the elevated bench. "Very well," she said, looking sternly at my lawyer. "You may proceed. Let us hear what you have." Dominic picked up the sleek silver tablet from our table. It was time to drop the hammer. It was time to absolutely annihilate her completely. Judge Harper adjusted her reading glasses and picked up the tablet. She tapped the screen. The audio connected to the courtroom speakers, filling the large space with crystal clear sound. The first recording played. It was the conversation from the living room on the morning Brittany called Adult Protective Services. The entire courtroom heard Brittany's shrill, desperate voice echoing through the speakers. I heard her explicit instructions to Kendrick. She told him to forge my signature on the quitclaim deed. She told him to backdate the document. She told him I was just a crazy old man and that no one would believe me. She orchestrated a massive federal crime right there on the audio track. Richard Sterling went completely pale. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. He jumped out of his chair and shouted an objection, claiming the audio was inadmissible. Judge Harper slammed her wooden gavel down so hard the sound cracked like a gunshot. She ordered Sterling to sit down and remain absolutely silent, or she would hold him in contempt of court. Sterling slowly sank back into his chair, a look of pure dread washing over him. But the audio was only the beginning. The screen on the tablet shifted to a video file. It was the recording I took with my smartphone in the grand foyer of their $10 million mansion on the day the bank froze their accounts. The video played on the large monitors mounted on the courtroom walls. Everyone in the room watched as the pristine, innocent mother sitting at the plaintiff's table transformed into a violent, racist monster. They watched her slap her husband violently across the face. The sharp sound of the physical assault made several reporters in the back row gasp out loud. Then came the words. The entire courtroom listened in absolute horror as Brittany unleashed a torrent of vile, degrading insults. They heard her call my son a useless black failure. They heard her scream that she wasted her youth on a massive disappointment. And then came the ultimate confession. They heard her explicitly state that she only married Kendrick for his money. She screamed that she only wanted his wealth and that she hated him because he was too stupid to successfully run a real estate scam against his own father. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the courtroom was so deep and so profound that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. I looked over at the plaintiff's table. Brittany was no longer crying fake tears. Her mouth was hanging wide open. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped her crumpled tissue onto the floor. The elegant victim facade had been entirely vaporized. She was completely exposed, stripped naked under the bright fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Richard Sterling pushed his chair away from her, physically creating distance between himself and his toxic client. He knew his career was in serious jeopardy just for bringing this fraudulent case to a judge. Judge Harper slowly lowered her reading glasses. She placed the silver tablet face down on the wooden bench. When she looked up, her face had turned to absolute stone. Her eyes were burning with a righteous judicial fury. She stared directly at Brittany, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Miss Cole. Judge Harper began, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen greed, I have seen manipulation, and I have seen spouses lie to get what they want. But I have rarely witnessed such a sickening display of premeditated fraud, domestic abuse, and racial malice. You sat in my courtroom today and attempted to use the legal system to extort millions of dollars from a man you conspired to defraud and commit to a psychiatric facility. Brittany tried to speak. She opened her mouth, stammering, trying to formulate an excuse, but no words came out. "Do not speak," Judge Harper commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. "I am ruling on this matter immediately. Your request for spousal support is denied in its entirety. Your request for a division of the Cole estate assets is denied. You entered this marriage for fraudulent financial gain, and you will leave it with absolutely nothing. Furthermore, regarding the $5 million debt incurred through the forged quitclaim deed, which you knowingly orchestrated and co-signed, I rule that the financial burden of that fraudulent loan rests entirely on your shoulders. You will not receive a single cent of protection from this court." Brittany let out a loud, horrified gasp. She grabbed the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles turning white. "But Your Honor," she shrieked, her voice echoing frantically, "I have no money. I cannot pay that debt. I will go to prison." Judge Harper leaned forward, her expression ruthless and unyielding. "That is a matter for the federal authorities, Miss Cole. I am immediately forwarding all the digital evidence presented today directly to the district attorney and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am officially recommending that they pursue maximum criminal charges against you for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and domestic assault." The gavel slammed down again, sealing her fate permanently. "This civil hearing is adjourned," Judge Harper announced, standing up from the bench. "Bailiffs, remove the plaintiff from my courtroom." Two large armed bailiffs approached the plaintiff's table immediately. They grabbed Brittany's arms. She completely lost her mind. The elegant facade shattered into a million pieces. She began screaming hysterically, thrashing her body against the bailiff's grip. She cursed my name, she cursed the judge, and she screamed that it was not fair. She dug her expensive high heels into the carpet, trying to resist, but the bailiffs were too strong. They dragged her backward down the center aisle of the courtroom. The reporters scrambled out of the way, snapping pictures of her crying, ruined face. Her screams echoed down the marble hallway outside long after the heavy wooden doors swung shut. The courtroom slowly emptied until only a few people remained. I sat at the defense table, perfectly calm. Dominic packed up the silver tablet and slid it back into his manila folder. The job was done. I turned my head and looked at the end of the defense table. Kendrick was sitting there, slumped in a wooden chair. He had watched the entire execution in complete silence. He watched his wife, the woman he committed a federal crime to please, get dragged away to face decades in prison. He watched his own life burn down to the foundation. Dominic slid a thick stack of legal papers across the table toward him. They were the absolute divorce documents and the full custody surrender forms for my grandson Malik. Kendrick did not argue. He did not beg or ask for a second chance. His arrogance was entirely gone. He picked up a black ink pen with trembling, blistered hands. He signed his name on every single dotted line, legally terminating his marriage and surrendering his only child to me. He was completely broken, a ghost of the man who stood on that gala stage just a month ago. He put the pen down and stared blankly at the polished wooden table. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an automated alert from my banking contacts. The final domino had just toppled. The private equity lenders, having received confirmation of the fraud, had officially initiated the immediate foreclosure protocols. The bank agents were currently pulling up to the driveway of the $10 million mansion to lock the gates and seize the property. The eviction was happening right now. Kendrick and Brittany were officially homeless. The drive from the courthouse to the north suburbs took exactly 45 minutes. I drove my 1998 Ford pickup truck. The engine rattled with a deep, familiar rhythm that I had trusted for decades. Sitting in the passenger seat next to me was my 7-year-old grandson, Malik. He was drinking a juice box and looking out the window, completely fascinated by the passing cars. He had absolutely no idea that the empire his parents claimed to rule had just been legally vaporized. He did not know that his mother was facing federal indictments or that his father had just signed away every single right to his own life. I kept the radio playing soft, old-school soul music to shield the boy from the brutal reality of the afternoon. Malik was safe. He was sitting in a truck paid for with honest money, wearing clothes bought with clean cash. I was not going to let the toxic radioactive fallout of his parents' greed touch a single hair on his head. I had already secured his future through a locked, ironclad trust. Now I just had to guide him through the wreckage of the present. We turned onto the winding, tree-lined street that led to Kendrick's massive $10 million estate. Usually the heavy wrought iron security gates were closed tight, keeping the neighborhood elites separated from the rest of the world. Today the gates were pushed wide open. The electronic keypad had been completely disabled. I pulled my truck over to the side of the street, parking just outside the property line. I left the engine running and the heat on. I turned to Malik and gave him a gentle smile. I told him to stay in the truck and listen to the music while his grandfather took care of some quick business. I promised him we would go get some deep dish pizza as soon as I was done. He smiled back, kicking his feet happily against the floorboard. He was entirely safe in his innocent bubble. I stepped out of the truck and walked slowly up the long paved driveway. The scene unfolding in front of the grand mansion was a masterpiece of financial destruction. It was the absolute clinical execution of a foreclosure. 3 black sport utility vehicles were parked aggressively across the pristine driveway, blocking the garage doors. 6 men in sharp gray suits were moving methodically around the property, carrying thick clipboards and digital tablets. They were asset recovery agents representing the private equity lenders. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to strip the carcass of my son's fake empire down to the bone. 2 uniformed sheriff deputies stood by the massive oak front doors with their hands resting casually on their utility belts, ensuring that the eviction proceeded without any physical violence. The agents were already slapping heavy yellow seizure stickers onto the windshields of the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway. Brittany's brand new Mercedes-Benz and Kendrick's imported sports car were officially property of the bank. The tow trucks were already idling on the street, waiting to drag the ultimate symbols of their fake wealth to an impound lot. I stood by the edge of the manicured lawn and watched the front doors swing open. The bank had given them exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises. They were not allowed to call a moving company. They were not allowed to bring out large furniture, flat-screen televisions, or expensive artwork. The bank considered all of those items collateral damage, subject to immediate liquidation to satisfy the massive $5 million fraudulent debt. Brittany came stumbling out of the front doors first. The elegant high society queen of Chicago real estate was dragging 2 heavy black plastic trash bags across the stone porch. The cheap plastic tore against the sharp edge of the marble steps, spilling a pile of imported silk blouses and expensive high heels onto the dirt. She was hyperventilating, her face streaked with ruined makeup and sweat. She dropped the trash bags and screamed at the lead bank agent. She demanded that they allow her to go back inside to retrieve her collection of designer handbags. She yelled that she was a victim and that those bags belonged to her personally. The lead agent, a tall man with a completely emotionless face, simply stepped in front of the door and shook his head. He informed her in a flat, robotic tone that every single asset inside the property boundaries was now frozen under federal mandate. He told her if she attempted to re-enter the property, the sheriff deputies would immediately arrest her for trespassing and obstruction of justice. Brittany let out a loud, guttural shriek of pure frustration. She kicked one of the stray high heels across the driveway, her pristine image entirely dissolved into madness. She was officially a woman with no home, no money, and no friends. The elite socialites she spent years trying to impress were nowhere to be found. Her cell phone had been ringing unanswered all morning. The gossip blogs had already done their damage. She was completely, utterly radioactive. A few seconds later, Kendrick walked slowly out of the front doors. My son looked like a hollow shell. He dragged a single black trash bag behind him, containing nothing but a few pairs of jeans and some plain cotton shirts. His expensive, custom-tailored suits were left hanging in the massive walk-in closet seized by the bank to pay for his crimes. He walked with a heavy slouch, his shoulders pulled down by the crushing gravity of his total failure. The lead bank agent stepped up to Kendrick and held out his hand. He did not ask politely. He simply demanded the master keys to the estate. Kendrick did not argue. He did not try to negotiate or beg for more time. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy ring of keys, and dropped them into the agent's waiting palm. The metal jingled sharply in the cold afternoon air. It was the sound of a kingdom falling. The agent immediately turned around, inserted a master key into the heavy oak doors, and locked the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. The mansion was officially sealed. Kendrick stood in the driveway, staring blankly at the locked doors. He had leveraged his father's land, forged a federal document, and destroyed his entire family, all to keep the keys to a house he could never truly afford. Now, he had absolutely nothing. He was standing in the cold Chicago wind with a garbage bag full of cheap clothes. I remained silent, watching from the edge of the driveway. I wanted him to feel the absolute bottom of the barrel. I wanted the cold, hard reality of poverty to sink deep into his bones. This was the exact starting line I had stood on 40 years ago. Now he was going to have to learn how to survive it. Brittany turned around and saw Kendrick standing there like a statue. Even now completely ruined and facing potential federal indictments, she could not drop her repulsive entitlement. She marched over to him, her face twisted in an ugly sneer. "What are you just standing there for?" she barked, her voice echoing shrilly across the seizing property. "Pull out your phone and call an Uber Black. I am not standing out here in the freezing cold next to a pile of garbage bags. We need to go to a hotel right now. Call a car, Kendrick. Do something useful for once in your miserable life." Kendrick slowly turned his head and looked at his wife. He looked at the woman who had slapped him across the face just days prior. He looked at the woman who had screamed racist insults at him and admitted she only married him to drain his bank accounts. He looked at the woman who had pushed him to commit a federal felony that almost cost him his freedom. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. The screen was still cracked from when he dropped it in the foyer. Brittany crossed her arms impatiently, tapping her foot on the pavement, expecting him to follow her orders, just like he had done for their entire toxic marriage. But Kendrick did not open a ride-sharing application. He looked at the cracked screen for a long moment. He remembered the legal documents he had signed on the defense table in the family courtroom just 2 hours ago. He remembered the absolute divorce decree. He remembered signing away his rights to the mansion, the cars, and the toxic facade. He remembered my brutal ultimatum. Kendrick looked up from the phone and stared directly into Brittany's eyes. For the first time in 10 years, he saw her exactly for what she was. A parasite, a greedy, manipulative anchor that had dragged him straight to the bottom of the ocean. He owed her absolutely nothing. He had no legal ties to her. He had no moral obligation to her. Their toxic alliance was officially dead and buried. Without saying a single word, Kendrick dropped his cracked smartphone onto the cold concrete driveway. He did not need it anymore. He reached down and grabbed the plastic knot of his single garbage bag. He hoisted the bag over his shoulder. He turned his back completely on Brittany and began to walk. He did not walk toward the locked mansion. He did not walk toward the seized luxury cars. He walked straight down the long paved driveway, heading toward the public bus stop out on the main commercial avenue. Brittany stood frozen in shock as she watched him walk away. "Kendrick, where are you going?" she screamed, her voice pitching into a hysterical panic. "You cannot leave me here. I have no money. I have no cards. Kendrick, come back here right now. I am your wife." Kendrick did not stop. He did not even turn his head to look back. He kept his head down, putting one foot in front of the other, walking away from the ruins of his fake life. He walked right past me, standing at the edge of the property. He did not ask me for a ride. He knew the terms of our agreement. He had to hit rock bottom on his own 2 feet. Brittany was left completely alone, standing in the middle of the driveway, surrounded by bank agents who ignored her entirely. She clutched her trash bag of clothes, shivering in the freezing wind, screaming at a husband who was never coming back. I turned around and walked back to my truck. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the heavy metal door, shutting out the sound of her frantic shrieks. Malik was still sitting in the passenger seat, happily listening to the old soul music, finishing his juice box. He looked over at me with big, bright eyes. "Are we going to get pizza now, Grandpa?" he asked, his voice pure and untainted. I put the truck into gear and smiled at my grandson. "Yes, little man," I said, steering the truck away from the seized mansion and leaving Brittany alone in the dust. "We are going to get the biggest pizza in the city. The bad times are officially over." The engine roared to life and we drove away. Behind us, the fake empire had been completely liquidated. The arrogant son was walking to a bus stop to begin his brutal punishment. The greedy daughter-in-law was abandoned on the street with absolutely nothing to her name. The slate was wiped clean. Now the real work of rebuilding a man from the dirt was about to begin. The wind coming off Lake Michigan in late November does not care about how much your coat costs. It cuts through fabric and flesh right down to the bone. It is a brutal, freezing wind that Chicago locals know all too well. For 30 years, I worked out in that bitter cold, laying bricks and mixing cement. I knew how to survive it. Brittany did not. She had spent the last decade of her life moving exclusively from heated luxury garages to climate-controlled penthouses. She had never stood on a cracked concrete sidewalk waiting for public transportation. Now she was standing at a filthy bus stop on the edge of the city limits, completely exposed to the elements. She was shivering violently. Her pristine white designer coat was stained with dirty melting snow from the street. At her feet sat 3 heavy black plastic garbage bags. They were filled with whatever silk dresses and expensive shoes she had managed to grab before the bank agents locked the massive oak doors of the mansion forever. The cheap plastic bags were ripping at the seams, exposing her imported cashmere to the freezing Chicago sludge. She looked absolutely pathetic. I watched her from a distance, parked a block away in my 1998 Ford pickup truck. I had dropped my grandson Malik off at my secure home with a trusted caretaker. I wanted to see the final chapter of Brittany's downfall with my own 2 eyes. I left the engine running, listening to the steady, reliable hum of the motor, while the heater kept the cabin perfectly warm. Through my windshield, I could see the frantic panic in her movements. She was holding her silver smartphone with trembling hands. Her manicured fingers were turning red from the freezing temperature. She was swiping across her screen, desperately trying to call the elite socialite friends she had spent years cultivating. I knew exactly who she was calling. She was calling the women from the country club. She was calling the board members of the charity foundation. She was calling the wives of the corrupt politicians she used to drink imported champagne with. She put the phone to her ear and waited. I watched her shoulders slump. Voicemail. She pulled the phone away, dialed another number, and lifted it to her freezing ear again. I watched her mouth move as she pleaded with whoever was on the other end. But there was no one on the other end. The call went straight to voicemail again. She tried a 3rd time, a 4th time, a 5th time. Every single one of her high society friends was pressing the ignore button. The gossip blogs had done their job perfectly. The news of the massive federal fraud investigation and the spectacular courtroom execution had spread through the Chicago elite like a wildfire. In their world, losing your money is a tragedy, but getting caught committing a federal crime is a highly contagious disease. Nobody wanted to be associated with a woman who was facing potential indictments for wire fraud and domestic assault. Brittany was officially a social pariah. She had been completely erased from their contact lists. I watched her scroll through her phone one more time. Her battery was dying in the extreme cold. I could see the sheer terror washing over her face as she realized that she was entirely alone. She had no access to cash. Her platinum and black credit cards were deactivated and useless. She did not even have the few dollars in loose change required to step onto the city bus that was slowly approaching the stop. She had spent her entire adult life believing that her worth was tied to her bank account. Now that the account was empty, she was discovering that her actual human value was absolutely nothing. She tried to call Richard Sterling, her sleazy divorce lawyer. I could tell by the way she screamed into the phone. But Sterling was a shark who only swam where the blood was rich with money. He knew Brittany had lost the case. He knew the judge had saddled her with a massive fraudulent debt. He had already blocked her number to avoid doing any unpaid legal work. She threw her phone into her purse and let out a loud, frustrated scream that was swallowed completely by the howling wind. I shifted my truck into drive. The heavy tires crunched against the icy asphalt. I drove slowly down the avenue, letting the powerful engine rumble through the quiet street. I did not rush. I wanted her to feel every single second of the freezing temperature. I approached the bus stop and eased my foot onto the brake pedal. The truck rolled to a complete stop right in front of the cracked concrete curb where she was standing. Brittany looked up. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying and the biting wind. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She saw the familiar rusted blue paint of my old Ford truck. A sudden spark of desperate, delusional hope ignited in her eyes. In her mind, I was still just the soft old man she used to manipulate. She actually believed that my paternal instincts would override my logic. She thought I was pulling over to rescue her from the freezing cold. She thought I was going to let her load her garbage bags of stolen clothes into my truck bed and drive her to a warm hotel. She stepped forward, leaving her torn trash bags on the dirty sidewalk. She rushed toward the passenger side of my truck, her hands reaching out eagerly for the door handle. I reached over and pressed the lock button. The heavy mechanical click echoed loudly inside the cabin. Brittany pulled on the handle, but the door did not budge. She tapped frantically on the cold glass, her breath fogging up the window. "Dexter!" she cried out, her voice muffled by the thick glass. "Please, Dexter, you have to help me. I am freezing. My friends will not answer the phone. I have no money for a taxi. Please let me in. I am sorry for what I said. I am so sorry. Please just give me a ride." I did not unlock the door. I did not lean over to let her in. I slowly reached for the manual window crank on the passenger side. I turned the handle, lowering the glass just a few inches. A blast of freezing Chicago air rushed into the warm cabin, carrying the smell of exhaust fumes and wet snow. Brittany leaned down, pressing her face near the narrow opening. She was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering together. "Dexter, please," she begged, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "I am the mother of your grandson. You cannot just leave me out here on the street like a stray dog. I have absolutely nothing left." I looked at her through the narrow gap in the window. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked at the woman who had slapped my son across the face. I looked at the woman who had screamed vile racist insults in the foyer of a mansion bought with stolen money. I looked at the woman who had tried to throw me into a psychiatric ward just so she could steal my legacy and fund her luxury vacations to Paris. I leaned across the front seat, getting close enough so she could hear every single syllable over the howling wind. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion whatsoever. "Looks like your value on the market just dropped below $2, Brittany," I said. Her desperate expression froze completely. The delusional hope in her eyes shattered into a million irreversible pieces. She finally understood that the bridge between us was not just burned, it was entirely obliterated. She realized that I was not a savior. I was the architect of her destruction. I did not wait for her to respond. I reached for the manual crank and rolled the window back up, sealing the warm cabin tight. The thick glass completely cut off the sound of her frantic pleading. I shifted the truck back into drive and pressed my foot down hard on the gas pedal. The old Ford engine roared to life. The heavy exhaust pipe let out a thick, dark cloud of diesel smoke right into the freezing air. The cloud enveloped Brittany completely. I looked in my rearview mirror as I drove away. She was standing alone on the dirty sidewalk, coughing in the exhaust fumes, surrounded by ripped garbage bags. The elite socialite was officially a ghost on the streets of Chicago. I turned the corner and never looked back. Her chapter in my life was permanently closed. But the story of my son was far from over. Brittany was freezing in the past, but Kendrick was currently walking straight toward his brutal future. He had made his choice. He had signed the absolute divorce papers. He had surrendered full custody of Malik. He had accepted my heavy terms to avoid wearing an orange jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary. Now it was time for him to pay the massive $5 million debt he owed me. The sun was beginning to set over the city, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete buildings, but his morning was already perfectly planned. There would be no sleeping in. There would be no silk sheets or catered breakfasts. Across town at the Oakwood construction site, the heavy yellow bulldozers and piles of jagged debris were waiting for him. The luxury condominium project he had tried to steal from my late wife was officially dead. The land was returning to its original purpose. It was time to build affordable housing for the community. And Kendrick was going to build it with his own two bare hands. The final clause of our legal contract was waiting to be fulfilled. The arrogant chief executive officer was about to learn exactly how much a dollar was worth. The alarm clock was set for 4 a.m. It was time for my son to pick up a shovel. It was time for him to pay his debt in the dirt. The wind coming off Lake Michigan is absolutely merciless. It is 6 a.m. and the sky over the city of Chicago is the color of bruised iron. The Oakwood project site is completely unrecognizable from what it was just 3 weeks ago. The glossy marketing billboards showing modern glass towers and imported marble lobbies have all been violently torn down. The high society vanity project is officially dead and buried. In its place is a raw, open wound in the freezing earth. We are returning this land to its original purpose. We are building affordable housing for the community. We are building solid, modest homes for working families. We are building a neighborhood for the exact kind of people my son used to look down upon from his corner office. I am standing inside the heated site manager trailer with a warm mug of black coffee in my hands. Through the reinforced glass window, I look out at the dirt lot. A city bus pulls up to the corner of the commercial avenue. The pneumatic doors hiss open, releasing a thick cloud of white steam into the freezing air. A single man steps out onto the cracked concrete sidewalk. It is my 40-year-old son, Kendrick. He is not wearing a custom-tailored charcoal tuxedo. He is not wearing imported Italian leather shoes that cost more than a monthly mortgage payment. He is wearing stiff, heavy canvas work pants he bought from a discount supply store. He is wearing a thick fluorescent orange safety jacket and a bright yellow plastic hard hat that looks completely alien on his head. His steel-toed work boots are perfectly clean. They have never seen a single day of mud or hard labor. He wraps his arms tightly around his chest, shivering violently as the bitter wind slaps him right in the face. He is entirely accustomed to heated leather car seats and climate-controlled private parking garages. The brutal physical reality of the working class is shocking his pampered system. He walks slowly through the chain-link gate, dragging his feet. He looks like a ghost haunting the graveyard of his own massive ego. He approaches the main staging area where the heavy equipment is idling. The site foreman is waiting for him. The foreman's name is Big John. He is a massive man built like a brick wall with 30 years of permanent calluses on his thick hands. Big John does not care about private equity loans. He does not care about charity galas or expensive champagne. Dominic briefed the foreman perfectly yesterday afternoon. Kendrick is not a chief executive officer on this site. He is not an investor. He is a minimum wage laborer at the absolute bottom of the food chain. He is a man working off a $5 million debt at $15 an hour. I watch through the glass as Kendrick walks up to Big John. Kendrick tries to stand up straight. He tries to muster up some of that old, polished corporate authority. He opens his mouth to introduce himself. Big John does not even look him in the eye. He just checks a name off a worn wooden clipboard. Then Big John turns around, grabs a heavy rusted iron shovel with a splintered handle and shoves it aggressively right into Kendrick's chest. Kendrick stumbles backward, catching the heavy tool awkwardly against his safety jacket. Big John points a thick finger toward a massive mountain of broken concrete, jagged rebar, and frozen mud at the far end of the dirt lot. He kicks a battered metal wheelbarrow toward my son. I cannot hear the words through the thick glass of the trailer, but I know exactly what the foreman is saying. He is telling him to start digging. He is telling him that he is on the clock, and that every single minute he wastes is money out of the foreman's pocket. Kendrick grabs the metal handles of the wheelbarrow. He drags it slowly through the thick, freezing sludge. The wheels sink deep into the mud, forcing him to push forward using his entire body weight. He reaches the massive pile of debris. He grips the wooden handle of the shovel. He drives the steel blade down hard into the frozen earth. The impact sends a violent, heavy shockwave right up his arms. I can see him wince in obvious pain. His soft, manicured hands are completely unaccustomed to violent physical impact. For 40 years, those hands have only typed corporate emails, signed fraudulent legal contracts, and held expensive crystal glasses. Now they are hitting solid, freezing concrete. He tries to lift a heavy chunk of cinder block with the shovel. His form is entirely wrong. He is lifting with his lower back instead of his legs. He dumps the heavy rock into the metal wheelbarrow. The loud crash echoes across the empty lot. He drives the shovel into the dirt again, and again, and again. 10 minutes pass, then 20 minutes. The freezing wind whips across the open lot, stinging his cheeks and making his eyes water. But beneath the heavy orange safety jacket, he is sweating profusely. The brutal physical exertion is completely shocking his cardiovascular system. He stops to catch his breath. He leans heavily against the wooden handle of the rusted shovel. His chest is heaving up and down rapidly. He slowly takes off his thick canvas work gloves. Even from the trailer window, I know exactly what he is looking at. Blisters. Massive, raw, red blisters are forming across his soft palms and the insides of his fingers. The tender skin is peeling away. The harsh friction of the rough wood is tearing his hands completely apart. He stares at his own palms in absolute horror and disbelief. This is the true physical currency of the working class. This is the exact physical pain I swallowed every single day for 30 years, so he could sit in a heated classroom and read textbooks about economics. He is finally feeling the actual physical weight of a single dollar. 30 years ago, I stood on this exact same plot of land. My late wife Sylvia and I bought this dirt when it was nothing but an abandoned lot filled with rusted-out cars and broken glass. I used to come here on my days off from the construction company. I would swing a heavy sledgehammer for 6 hours straight, clearing the concrete just so we could have a clean foundation to build her dream. My hands bled exactly like his are bleeding right now, but my blood was spilled out of pure love. I was building a secure future for my family. I was building a strong foundation so my son would never have to know the bitter, crushing taste of poverty. Kendrick took that beautiful foundation and sold it to private equity sharks so he could buy expensive watches and impress elitist people who did not even care about his actual soul. He is learning the hardest lesson a man can ever learn. You cannot skip the steps of building character. When you inherit a kingdom without ever lifting a single stone to build the castle, you end up burning the whole thing down to the ground. Kendrick thought he was vastly superior to the working class. He thought the men in the high-visibility jackets and the steel-toed boots were far beneath his high intellect. Now he is standing shoulder to shoulder with them, but he is the absolute poorest man on the entire site. The men working next to him get to go home to their loving families with a steady paycheck. Kendrick is shoveling freezing dirt just to stay out of a federal prison cell. The wind picks up howling aggressively off the lake. It whips across the open dirt lot, kicking up a thick cloud of freezing gray dust. Kendrick turns his head and coughs violently. The dark dust coats his face, sticking to the sweat rolling down his cheeks. He looks absolutely miserable. Every single muscle in his soft, unconditioned body is rejecting the manual labor. I watch him try to massage his lower back. He bends backward, grimacing in severe, agonizing pain. Big John walks by carrying a massive heavy stack of wooden planks on his broad shoulder as if they weigh absolutely nothing. He stops walking and glares at my son. He points aggressively at the half-empty wheelbarrow, barking a loud command. Kendrick flinches at the loud, authoritative tone. He is completely stripped of his corporate defensive mechanisms. He cannot call human resources. He cannot threaten to fire the man. He is a powerless ghost, trapped in the brutal purgatory of his own massive financial debt. Kendrick grabs the freezing metal handles of the wheelbarrow again. He pushes forward aggressively. His boots slip hard in the wet, freezing mud. He drops to one knee, landing violently in the brown sludge. The heavy wheelbarrow tips sideways, spilling half of the broken concrete rocks back onto the frozen ground. Kendrick stays on his knee in the freezing mud for a very long time. His head hangs low. He is staring blankly at the dirt. I know he is crying. I can see the subtle, heavy shaking of his shoulders. He is mourning the brutal death of his fake life. He is mourning the loss of his $10 million mansion, his luxury imported cars, and the beautiful, greedy wife who abandoned him at a public bus stop. He is mourning the total illusion of his own greatness. I take another slow sip of my hot black coffee. I watch him struggle in the mud. I will not send a site manager out there to help him up. I will not call the foreman and tell him to go easy on the boy. If I rescue him right now, the entire lesson is completely ruined. He has to feel the absolute rock bottom. He has to deeply understand that nobody is coming to save him. Eventually, Kendrick wipes his face with the dirty, wet sleeve of his bright orange jacket. He slowly pushes himself up from the mud. His heavy pants are completely soaked through with freezing, dirty water. He reaches down and grabs the heavy chunks of concrete with his bare, blistered hands, throwing them back into the metal wheelbarrow. He picks up the rusted shovel and goes right back to the grueling work. It is then that he stops digging and turns slowly toward the site manager trailer. He looks straight through the large, reinforced glass window. He sees me standing there in the warm light holding my coffee mug. He sees the man he auctioned off for $2 watching him work in the dirt. I stand perfectly still. I wait for the angry glare. I wait for the look of pure, unadulterated hatred. I fully expect him to look at me with the same venomous resentment he showed me in the grand foyer of his mansion when I demanded he divorce his wife and surrender his only son. I expect the spoiled, arrogant boy to fiercely rebel against his brutal punishment. But the glare never comes. Kendrick looks at me standing in the warm, safe trailer. He looks down at his own bleeding, blistered hands. He looks at the massive mountain of dirt he still has to move. The sheer crushing weight of the last 3 weeks finally breaks entirely through his massive ego. The fake charity galas, the imported champagne, the tailored suits, and the hollow corporate titles are all completely dead. He is standing in the absolute ruins of his own massive hubris. He does not yell. He does not shake his fist in defiance. He simply lowers his head. His shoulders slump in complete and total submission. He reaches down and picks up the heavy rusted shovel, gripping it tightly with his bleeding hands. He turns his back to the trailer, drives the steel blade deep into the frozen Chicago mud, and keeps shoveling. My new house sits at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a working-class neighborhood. It does not have marble columns or crystal chandeliers. It does not have a 10-car garage filled with imported European sports cars. It is a solid brick house built on a thick concrete foundation. It has a heavy steel security gate, high-definition cameras, and a reinforced front door. It is a fortress designed to keep the toxic noise of the world completely outside. This is where I brought my 7-year-old grandson Malik to live. The transition from a $10 million mega mansion to a practical 4-bedroom home was a massive shock to the boy. When we first walked through the front door, he dropped his small backpack on the hardwood floor and looked around with wide, confused eyes. He asked me where the private chef was. He asked me who was going to unpack his bags. He looked for the massive playroom filled with thousands of dollars of untouched electronic toys. I knelt down to his eye level and placed my large, calloused hands on his small shoulders. I told him that in this house we unpack our own bags. I told him that in this house we cook our own food and we wash our own plates. I watched a brief flicker of panic cross his face. For his entire short life, his mother Brittany had taught him that manual labor was for lesser people. She had taught him that snapping his fingers would magically produce whatever he desired. He was already infected with the very early stages of the exact same arrogant disease that had completely destroyed his father. I knew I had to pull that poison out of his veins before it settled into his heart permanently. But I also knew I had to do it gently. He was just a child. He was an innocent casualty in a war created by 2 incredibly greedy adults. The first few nights were the hardest. Malik would wake up crying, asking where his mother was. He would ask why his father was not coming home from work in his fancy suit. It took every single ounce of my self-control not to tell the boy the brutal, ugly truth. I wanted to tell him that his mother abandoned him at a public bus stop because her credit cards were declined. I wanted to tell him that his father was currently digging in the freezing mud to avoid a federal prison sentence. But a real man does not poison a child's mind against his own parents. A coward uses children as weapons in a divorce. I am not a coward. So I sat on the edge of his bed and rubbed his back until his breathing slowed down. I told him that his mother and father were currently going through a very difficult time. I told him they had made some serious mistakes and that they were away learning how to fix them. I promised him that he was absolutely safe with me and that nothing bad would ever happen to him under my roof. I absorbed his tears and I carried his confusion so he would not have to. By the second week, the boy started to adapt. Children are incredibly resilient if you give them a stable, quiet environment. He stopped asking for the private chef. He started helping me wash the dishes after dinner. He stood on a small wooden step stool at the kitchen sink, his hands covered in soapy water, scrubbing the plates with a serious look of concentration on his face. I saw a spark of genuine pride in his eyes when he finished. He was learning the very first lesson of self-reliance. He was learning that he was capable of taking care of himself. On a bright Saturday morning, the weather finally broke. The brutal Chicago winter loosened its grip, and the early spring sun warmed the backyard. I decided it was time for the next lesson. I walked into the kitchen where Malik was eating a bowl of oatmeal. I told him to put on a pair of old jeans and some sturdy shoes. I told him we were going to work outside in the dirt. He frowned immediately. His mother had always told him that dirt was disgusting. She used to scold him if he even stepped off the paved driveway at the old mansion. She treated the earth like it was a disease. I just smiled at him and walked out the back door. I knew curiosity would eventually pull him outside. 10 minutes later, the back screen door creaked open. Malik stepped out onto the wooden deck, looking unsure. I was already kneeling in the grass, preparing a large rectangular wooden planter box. I was using a small metal hand trowel to break up the dense, dark soil. I wore an old pair of leather work gloves and a faded denim shirt. I waved him over to me. He walked across the grass, stepping carefully as if the ground might swallow him whole. He stood next to the wooden planter box, looking down at the dark, wet earth. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled paper envelope. I held it out to him. "Do you know what is inside this envelope, Malik?" I asked him, my voice low and steady. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the worn paper. "These are tomato seeds," I explained. "Your grandmother Sylvia saved these seeds 30 years ago. She grew the most beautiful tomatoes on the entire south side of Chicago. She used to say that you can never truly appreciate the taste of a meal until you understand the sweat and the patience it takes to grow it from the ground up." Malik looked at me and then looked back at the dirt. "But the grocery store has tomatoes," he said, his voice full of innocent logic. "We can just go buy them." I nodded slowly, acknowledging his point. "You are right, little man. We can buy them. But when you buy something with money, you only know the price of it. You do not know the value of it. Anyone with a piece of plastic in your wallet can buy a tomato, but it takes a patient, careful man to grow one. It takes a man who is not afraid to get his hands dirty." I patted the soil next to me. I told him to kneel down. He hesitated for a long moment, fighting against years of his mother's toxic conditioning. Then very slowly, he lowered himself onto the grass. He knelt right next to me, his small knees pressing into the soft earth. I handed him the metal trowel. I guided his small hand over the wooden handle. We pressed the steel blade down into the dirt together. We turned the soil over, breaking up the hard clumps, exposing the rich, dark earth underneath. The smell of the wet soil rose up into the spring air. It was a clean, honest smell. It was the smell of potential. At first, Malik tried to keep his hands perfectly clean. He tried to hold the trowel with just 2 fingers. But as we kept working, the rhythm of the labor caught his attention. He forgot about his mother's rules. He forgot about the spotless marble floors of the mansion. He dropped the trowel and just shoved his bare hands right into the dirt. He laughed out loud as the cool, wet mud squished between his small fingers. It was a beautiful, pure sound. It was the sound of a boy finally being allowed to just be a boy. We spent 2 hours working in the sun. We measured the spacing for the plants. We dug the small, shallow holes. I let him carefully pinch the tiny dry seeds from the paper envelope and drop them exactly into the center of each hole. We gently covered them with soil, patting the earth down firmly but carefully. Then we took the green garden hose and watered the bed, watching the dry dirt turn dark and heavy as it absorbed the moisture. We sat back on the grass, completely covered in mud. Malik's face had a streak of dirt right across his forehead. His shoes were ruined and his jeans were stained brown. He looked absolutely exhausted, but he had a massive, proud smile on his face. He looked at the long wooden planter box as if he had just built an entire skyscraper. "We have to wait now, Grandpa," he asked, wiping his forehead and spreading more dirt across his face. "Yes, we have to wait," I replied, looking out at our work. "We have to water them every day. We have to pull the weeds so they do not steal the nutrients. We have to protect them from the bugs. We have to put in the work long before we ever see a single red tomato. That is what building something real takes. It takes time, and it takes care." I sat there in the grass looking at my grandson. I was trying to pass down the exact same lessons I had tried to teach his father Kendrick 30 years ago. I had brought Kendrick out into the yard when he was a boy, hoping to teach him the value of hard work. But Kendrick had complained. He had whined about the heat and the dirt. He had abandoned the garden to go sit inside an air-conditioned room. I failed to force the lesson on my son, and it ultimately cost him his entire life. I was not going to make the same mistake twice. I was breaking the generational curse of entitlement right here in this soil. I was building a stronger man out of this boy. We stood up and walked toward the back patio to wash our hands at the outdoor sink. The cold water ran over our muddy fingers, turning the water brown as it circled the drain. Malik scrubbed his small hands diligently, watching the mud wash away. He was quiet for a few minutes. The proud smile slowly faded from his face, replaced by a serious, thoughtful expression. He looked down at the running water and then looked up at me. "Grandpa," he said, his voice small and hesitant. "My dad used to wear a suit every day. He used to talk on his phone and tell a lot of people what to do. He said he was the boss of the whole city." I turned off the metal faucet. I dried my hands on an old cotton towel and handed it to him. I waited for him to finish his thought. "When is my dad going to be a boss again?" Malik asked, looking up at me with those big, curious eyes. I looked down at the boy. I thought about Kendrick currently miles away, covered in freezing mud, digging through the ruins of his own failed luxury project. I thought about the blisters on his hands and the crushing weight of his massive $5 million debt. I placed my hand gently on the back of Malik's head, looking him directly in his eyes so he would remember my next words for the rest of his life. "A real boss is not someone who wears a fancy suit and yells at people, Malik. I told him, my voice rumbling with absolute certainty. A real boss is not someone who drives a fast car or lives in a giant house. A real boss is someone who cleans up his own messes. Your father is learning how to do that right now. 6 months is a massive amount of time when you are paying off a $5 million debt with nothing but the sweat on your own back and the blisters on your hands. The brutal, freezing Chicago winter slowly melted away, turning the frozen mud of the Oakwood project into a sweltering, humid oven. Summer in the city is an unforgiving beast. It bakes the concrete, it warps the wood, and it completely drains the life out of anyone forced to work under the open, aggressive sky. But every single morning at 5:45, my son Kendrick walked through the chain-link gates of the construction site. He did not miss a single day of work. He did not call in sick when the temperature hit 95 degrees with 90% humidity. He did not complain to the site foreman when his back muscles cramped so hard he could barely stand up straight. He just put on his bright yellow hard hat, grabbed his heavy rusted tools, and went straight to work in the dirt. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in a depressing rundown strip mall in Ohio, his ex-wife Brittany was experiencing her own personal version of rock bottom. Dominic, my corporate investigator, kept very close tabs on her just to ensure she never tried to slither her way back into our lives. She was working as a front register cashier at a discount retail store, scanning cheap plastic toys and ringing up clearance clothing for minimum wage. The woman who used to fly first class to Paris on my dime and drink imported champagne at charity galas was now wearing a terrible polyester uniform and standing on her aching feet for 8 exhausting hours a day. The family court judge had forwarded her blatant forgery evidence directly to the state and federal authorities, resulting in a massive mountain of legal fines and severe federal penalties. Every single week, the government ruthlessly garnished her pathetic paycheck before she even saw a dime of it. Her elite high society friends had completely forgotten her name the moment her credit cards were declined. She was a ghost, trapped in a miserable prison of her own making, and she had absolutely no one to blame but her own blinding greed. But Kendrick was on a completely different trajectory. The brutal physical labor was doing something to him that a fancy degree from Harvard never could. The grueling, endless work was acting like a furnace, violently burning away the absolute rot in his soul. One scorching Wednesday afternoon in late August, I decided it was finally time to visit the job site. I did not call ahead to announce my arrival. I parked my 1998 Ford pickup truck across the street and walked slowly onto the active construction zone. The affordable housing units were actually taking real shape. The thick concrete foundations were fully poured and the heavy wooden framing was rising up toward the sky. I walked past the roaring cement mixers and the loud diesel generators until I found him working near the back fence. Kendrick was hauling a massive heavy stack of drywall across the uneven dirt lot. He was shirtless underneath his bright orange safety vest. His skin was baked a dark rich brown by the relentless summer sun. He was shining with thick sweat and covered from head to toe in a heavy layer of gray construction dust. He looked completely and utterly exhausted. His shoulders sagged under the immense crushing weight of the building materials, but he did not stop moving. He did not drop the heavy load to take a break. He carried the drywall all the way to the framing crew, set it down carefully, wiped his face, and immediately turned around to go back for another heavy stack. I walked over to a red plastic cooler sitting near the site manager's trailer and pulled out a freezing cold bottle of water. Condensation dripped down the sides of the plastic. I walked right into the middle of the dirt path, blocking his way back to the supply pile. Kendrick stopped dead in his tracks. He wiped the stinging sweat from his forehead with the back of his dirty forearm, leaving a dark, muddy streak across his face. He looked at me. There was absolutely no fear in his eyes. There was no lingering anger. There was no toxic resentment hiding in the corners of his expression. There was just a profound, quiet exhaustion and an unexpected, deep sense of peace. I held the cold plastic bottle out toward him. He looked at the water for a second before reaching out and taking it from my grasp. When his fingers brushed against mine, I felt the thick, rough skin. The soft, smooth, manicured hands of the arrogant chief executive officer were completely gone forever. In their place were thick, heavy calluses, cracked skin, and deep, ugly scars from handling rough timber and sharp steel for 6 straight months. These were the hands of a real working man. These were hands that finally understood the absolute bleeding value of a single dollar. I looked at his calloused fingers, and I saw a reflection of my own hands from 30 years ago. He twisted the plastic cap off the bottle and drank the entire thing in less than 10 seconds. He crushed the empty plastic bottle in his strong fist and let out a long, heavy breath. We stood there in the blistering summer heat, surrounded by the deafening mechanical noise of the active construction site. For the first time in over 10 years, we were standing face to face without a heavy mahogany desk, without a tailored designer suit, and without a fake high society charity gala standing between us. I braced myself for the usual routine. I fully expected him to ask for a reduction in his massive $5 million debt. I expected him to beg for a quiet desk job back in the air-conditioned corporate office. I fully expected the spoiled, arrogant boy to make one last, desperate, pathetic attempt to escape his grueling physical punishment. I waited for the excuses to start pouring out of his mouth. Kendrick looked down at the crushed plastic bottle in his dirty hands. Then he lifted his chin and looked me directly in the eyes. He did not ask for his monumental debt to be forgiven. He did not ask for a corner office or a luxury company car. He simply cleared his dry, dusty throat and asked me one single question. Is Malik doing okay? His voice was raspy and quiet, but the heavy emotional weight behind those 5 words hit me harder than a runaway freight train. My heart actually skipped a heavy beat inside my chest. He did not ask about the frozen bank accounts. He did not ask about the seized $10 million mansion or the towed sports cars. He asked about his son. He asked about the boy he had surrendered to me 6 months ago. I looked at the man standing in front of me, covered in cheap dirt and honest sweat. The arrogant, entitled boy who had laughed at me on a brightly lit stage was completely dead and permanently buried in the Chicago mud. The brutal, grueling labor had successfully burned away the toxic waste in his mind, leaving behind the raw, solid, unshakable foundation of a real man. The punishment had worked exactly as I designed it. The silent adjustment had successfully and completely rebuilt my son from the ground up. I kept my posture perfectly straight, but a deep, unfamiliar warmth spread rapidly through my chest. I looked at his calloused hands and then back up to his tired, humble eyes. Malik is doing just fine, I told him, my voice steady and calm, but carrying a new layer of profound respect. He helped me plant tomato seeds in the backyard a few months ago. We just harvested the first big red ones yesterday afternoon. He is eating very well, and he is learning how to clean up after his own messes. Kendrick let out a soft, shaky breath and nodded his head slowly. A small, genuine smile cracked through the thick layer of dirt and sweat on his face. "That is good," he whispered, his voice filled with an overwhelming sense of deep relief. "That is really good. Thank you for taking care of him. I know he is absolutely safe with you." He turned his body, ready to walk back toward the massive pile of drywall to continue his brutal afternoon shift. He fully accepted his place in the dirt. He accepted the heavy consequences of his past actions without a single complaint. He was a man paying his dues. Before he could take another step away from me, I spoke up, raising my voice just enough to carry over the loud roar of the spinning cement mixers. "I am making a large pot of beef stew this Sunday afternoon," I said, locking my eyes onto his back. Malik has been asking a lot of questions lately about how building houses actually works. He wants to know how the wood stays together. I think it is time he hears the answer from a man who actually knows how to swing a heavy hammer. "You can come by the house at 2 o'clock on Sunday, Kendrick. Just make sure you wash the dirt off your hands before you sit at my dinner table." Kendrick froze completely still in the middle of the dirt path. He turned his head, slowly looking back at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. He swallowed hard, fighting back a sudden violent rush of tears that threatened to spill over his dusty cheeks. The sheer weight of the invitation hit his exhausted soul. He did not say a single word. He did not have to. He simply squared his tired shoulders and gave me a firm, deeply respectful nod. He turned around and walked back to the massive supply pile, walking a little taller and a little stronger than he had before I arrived. The $5 million debt was still hanging heavily over his head, and he would be paying it off for a very long time. But the moral debt, the debt of respect and honor, was finally paid in full. The man I had always wanted him to be, the man I knew he could become, was finally waking up from a decade-long nightmare. I turned around and walked back to my old Ford truck, leaving the construction site behind me. The grueling work was far from over, but for the first time in 10 years, my family was finally healing. The view from the top floor of the Cole Holdings corporate high-rise is absolutely breathtaking. You can see the entire sprawling skyline of Chicago stretching out for miles in every single direction. For the last 10 years, my son Kendrick sat in this exact same leather chair looking out through these massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He used to sit up here and believe he was the absolute king of the world. He thought he was completely untouchable. But looking down at the city from a heated glass tower does not make you a king. It just makes you blind to the people struggling down on the ground. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany boardroom table. The room was perfectly quiet. It was a deep, productive silence. Just 3 months ago, this boardroom was a toxic circus. Kendrick had filled these expensive leather chairs with a dozen useless corporate parasites. He had hired weak men in expensive suits who did nothing but flatter his massive ego and rubber stamp his terrible financial decisions. They were professional yes-men who happily drank his imported coffee while the company was secretly bleeding millions of dollars. When I took back total executive control of my empire, the very first thing I did was clean house. I did not send polite corporate emails. I did not offer generous severance packages. I walked into this boardroom with Dominic standing right behind me, and I fired every single one of Kendrick's sycophants in less than 10 minutes. I watched them scramble to pack their designer briefcases and scurry to the elevators like frightened mice. Then I brought a massive financial axe down on the rest of his fake empire. I permanently canceled the ridiculous charity galas that were nothing but an excuse to drink expensive champagne and take photographs for society magazines. I liquidated the absurd corporate leases on the fleet of luxury sports cars. I completely terminated the bloated marketing budgets, the country club memberships, and the unnecessary public relations teams. I stripped the entire company right down to the bare wooden floorboards. I took Cole Holdings back to its original roots. We stopped trying to build flashy glass penthouses for the ultra-rich. We went back to buying solid brick buildings and developing practical commercial spaces for working-class businesses. And within just a few short months, the aggressive financial bleeding stopped completely. The accounts turned green again. The company was finally thriving, breathing fresh air cleansed of the toxic arrogance that had almost dragged it straight into federal bankruptcy. Sitting across from me at the long wooden table was Dominic. My corporate fixer looked exactly as he always did, wearing a sharp, dark suit and an expression of absolute, serious focus. He did not care about the beautiful view of the city. He only cared about the legal documents sitting in front of him. Dominic slid a thick, heavy stack of crisp white papers across the polished mahogany table toward me. He placed a heavy silver fountain pen right on top of the stack. "These are the finalized documents for the Malik Cole Generational Trust," Dominic said, his deep voice echoing slightly in the large, empty room. "Everything is drafted exactly according to your strict specifications, Dexter. The legal framework is absolutely ironclad. No team of lawyers, no corrupt judge, and certainly no greedy relative will ever be able to pierce the armor of this trust." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. This was not just a legal document. This was the ultimate culmination of my entire life's work. This was the exact mechanism I was using to permanently break the generational curse of entitlement that had completely destroyed my son. When I was a young man breaking my back on construction sites, I believed that the ultimate goal of a father was to give his children an easier life. I thought that if I absorbed all the physical pain and all the brutal financial stress, my son would be free to pursue a higher level of greatness. I sent Kendrick to Harvard with a blank check. I bought him a clean, smooth path. And that smooth path turned him into a monster. It turned him into a man who felt absolutely no empathy for the working class because he had never spent a single day standing in their shoes. I was not going to make that exact same fatal mistake with my grandson Malik. I was going to leave him a massive financial empire, but I was going to make absolutely sure he had the strong, calloused hands required to carry it. I picked up the silver pen and began to read through the specific clauses Dominic had drafted. The rules of the trust were brutally strict. Malik would not receive a single penny of his inheritance when he turned 18. He would not receive a brand new sports car for his high school graduation. He would not get a blank check to travel across Europe and pretend to find himself while partying in expensive hotels. According to the legal documents, Malik was completely locked out of the primary trust funds until his 30th birthday. He had to spend the entire decade of his 20s figuring out how to survive on his own merits. He had to feel the panic of a late rent payment. He had to understand the deep, burning frustration of looking at a low bank account balance. He had to learn how to budget, how to save, and how to earn his own keep. But waiting until he was 30 was only the baseline requirement. I read the next clause, which was the most important rule in the entire document. In order to unlock the corporate shares and the family wealth, Malik had to successfully complete a full college degree. But a piece of paper from a fancy university was not enough to inherit my empire. A degree only proves that you know how to sit in a classroom and memorize books. It does not prove that you know how to be a man. The final clause was absolute. After finishing his education, Malik was legally required to work a full-time manual labor blue-collar job for 2 continuous years. He had to work a job that paid an hourly wage. He had to wear steel-toed boots, or a mechanic's uniform, or a heavy canvas apron. He had to come home every single night with dirt under his fingernails and aching muscles in his back. He had to spend 24 solid months working shoulder to shoulder with the exact same kind of men his father had laughed at. I wanted Malik to know exactly how much a single dollar costs when you have to trade your physical sweat to earn it. I wanted him to understand that the people pouring the concrete and fixing the pipes are the absolute backbone of this entire country. Only after he completed those 2 years of brutal, honest physical labor would the gates of the trust finally open. Only a man who knows how to build a house from the mud deserves to hold the keys to the castle. "This is perfect, Dominic," I said, my voice steady and firm. "You covered every single loophole. Brittany will never be able to touch a dime of this money, and Malik will have to build his own character before he ever touches my bank accounts." I pressed the silver pen against the thick paper. I signed my name with a heavy, deliberate stroke. I signed the next page and the next. With every single signature, I was locking away millions of dollars into a secure, protective vault. I was legally transferring the immense weight of my legacy out of the hands of the arrogant elite and placing it into a safe waiting for a boy to become a worthy man. When I finished signing the very last page, I placed the silver pen down on the table. The silence in the boardroom returned, settling over us like a heavy, warm blanket. The corporate war was officially over. The company was completely secure. My grandson was legally protected. The brutal storm of the last several months had finally passed, leaving behind a clean, solid foundation. Dominic gathered the thick stack of signed papers and tapped the edges against the mahogany table to perfectly align them. He slid the documents into a heavy leather briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut. He stood up from his chair, buttoning his dark suit jacket. He looked around the massive, empty boardroom. He looked at the long, polished table and the rows of empty leather chairs. Then he turned his sharp, observant eyes toward the head of the table. He looked at the large executive chair where Kendrick used to sit and pretend to be the king of Chicago. Dominic looked back down at me. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the subtle, quiet curiosity hiding in his eyes. He had stood by my side while we completely destroyed Kendrick's fake life. He had watched me force my son into the freezing mud to pay off a $5 million debt with a rusted shovel. He knew exactly how ruthless I could be. "Dexter," Dominic said, his deep voice completely calm. "The company is stabilized. The assets are locked. You have completely neutralized every single threat against your family legacy. But I have to ask you one final question." I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands on the armrests. "Go ahead, Dominic," I replied. "You have earned the right to ask me anything you want." Dominic looked at the empty executive chair again. "Are you ever going to let Kendrick walk back into this building?" he asked directly. "Are you ever going to let him sit in that chair again and return to the boardroom?" I looked out the massive glass windows at the sprawling city of Chicago. I thought about the text message I received from the site foreman just yesterday afternoon. Big John had sent me a picture of my 40-year-old son. Kendrick was covered in thick gray concrete dust, pushing a heavy wheelbarrow full of broken cinder blocks under the blazing summer sun. He looked completely exhausted, but his shoulders were squared and his head was held high. He was not complaining. He was not begging for a bailout. He was finally doing the brutal, honest work of a real man. He was paying his massive debt, one single heavy shovel full of dirt at a time. I looked back at Dominic. I did not smile, but a deep, quiet sense of peace settled firmly into my chest. The spoiled, arrogant boy who auctioned his father off for $2 was dead and permanently buried. The man who was slowly rising from that dirty construction site was someone I might actually be able to respect. Maybe I said, my voice echoing softly, but carrying the absolute weight of a finalized promise. When he fully proves that he knows how to handle a shovel, maybe I will finally let him handle a pen. The Sunday afternoon sun casts long, warm shadows across the thick green grass of my backyard. The air is perfectly still and quiet. Inside the kitchen, a large, heavy, cast-iron pot of beef stew is simmering slowly on the stove. The rich, thick smell of roasted meat and potatoes fills the entire house. It is the exact same meal my late wife Sylvia used to make for us when we lived in a tiny, cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago. It is the smell of a real home. It is the smell of honest survival and hard work. A heavy engine rumbles down the quiet suburban street. I sit in my sturdy wooden rocking chair on the front porch and watch a battered silver pickup truck pull into my driveway. The engine clicks off. The heavy metal door swings open and my 40-year-old son steps out onto the pavement. Kendrick is not wearing a $10,000 custom tuxedo. He is not wearing imported Italian leather shoes or a silk tie. He is wearing a faded gray cotton t-shirt and a pair of cheap heavy denim work jeans covered in dried white concrete dust. His steel-toed boots are scuffed and deeply scarred from months of brutal physical labor at the Oakwood construction site. He looks completely exhausted. His shoulders carry the heavy natural slump of a man who has spent the last 60 hours shoveling freezing mud and hauling heavy wooden planks. But as he walks up the concrete driveway toward my front porch, his head is held high and his steps are firm and deliberate. He walks like a man who actually owns his own soul. He walks up the wooden steps of the porch. He stops in front of my rocking chair and looks me directly in the eyes. There is no arrogance left in his expression. There is no toxic entitlement. There is only a deep, quiet respect. He nods his head to me once. I nod back. I point toward the front door, telling him that the stew is almost ready and that his son is waiting for him inside the living room. Kendrick walks through the heavy front door. I do not follow him immediately. I stay on the porch listening through the open screen door. I hear the sound of heavy work boots walking across the hardwood floor. I hear the water running in the kitchen sink as he thoroughly washes the thick dirt and heavy grease off his calloused, blistered hands. He remembers the one strict rule I gave him. He washes his hands completely clean before he sits at my dinner table. Then I hear the absolute best sound in the entire world. I hear my 7-year-old grandson Malik yell the word "Dad." I hear the heavy thud of Kendrick dropping to his knees on the living room floor to catch his boy in a tight embrace. I stand up from my rocking chair and walk quietly into the house. I stand in the hallway and watch them from the shadows. Kendrick is sitting cross-legged on the simple woven rug right in the middle of the living room. Malik is sitting right across from him. Between them is a massive scattered pile of brightly colored plastic Lego bricks. They are building a small house together. Malik is snapping the tiny plastic walls into place while Kendrick hands him the correct pieces. Kendrick is smiling. It is not the fake, predatory smile he used to wear at high society charity galas. It is a real, tired, genuine smile. His thick, scarred hands look huge next to the small plastic toys, but he moves with careful, gentle precision. I look around the quiet living room. There are no flashing cameras here. There are no wealthy real estate investors waiting to be impressed. There are no crystal champagne flutes, and there are no elite socialites wearing expensive diamond necklaces. There is no Britney pacing the room screaming about luxury cars and private equity loans. All of that toxic garbage was completely incinerated. The massive $5 million debt, the federal fraud investigation, the seized mansion, and the public humiliation have all faded into the distant past. What is left is exactly what matters most in this world. A father and a son sitting on a rug building something real together with their own 2 hands. I turn around and walk back out onto the front porch. I lower myself back into the wooden rocking chair and look out at the quiet street. The war is officially over. The silent adjustment is fully complete. The empire is safe and the generational curse is permanently broken. I lean back and listen to the faint sound of my son and grandson laughing together inside the house. Blood does not give anyone the right to disrespect you. People think that sharing a last name means you have to tolerate abuse, manipulation, and blinding greed. They are completely wrong. Generational wealth is an absolute curse if it is not paired with generational wisdom. If you hand a massive fortune to a boy who has never lifted a heavy shovel, you are simply handing him the matches he will use to burn his own house down. You do not buy respect. You earn it in the dirt. You earn it by taking full responsibility for your own massive failures. And you certainly never let anyone auction off your dignity for a cheap laugh in a room full of greedy strangers. Sometimes to save a man from himself, you cannot just throw him a life preserver. Sometimes you have to let his false world burn entirely to the ground. You have to let him lose the fake friends, the greedy wife, and the stolen money. You have to force him to stand in the absolute ruins of his own arrogance so he can finally learn how to rebuild himself from the mud. It was a brutal, agonizing lesson. It cost him his mansion, his toxic marriage, and his foolish pride. But looking at the honest, hardworking man sitting on my living room floor right now, I know it was worth every single painful second. My name is Dexter Cole, and I am priceless.